Live from the Louisiana Superdome, NBC News continues its coverage of America's conventions. The Republicans in New Orleans. Now reporting live from the Superdome, here is NBC News correspondent Tom Brokaw.
Good evening once again. I'm here with John Chancellor and the entire NBC News team, and the watchword for the night is let the good times roll, because tonight Vice President George Bush will become the Republican nominee for President of the United States, a cherished goal for this man who has spent most of his adult life in public service working for others, working for Richard Nixon, working for Gerald Ford, and for the last 8 years, of course, working for President Reagan as his number 2 man. Now, at the age of 64, it's George Bush's turn to be number 1. He does face, of course, a daunting challenge, a unified Democratic Party, Mike Dukakis and Lloyd Bentsen, and he also has the challenge of following in the footsteps of Ronald Reagan, one of the personally most popular presidents in the history of this country. Today, however, George Bush was busy putting a new face on the Republican Party. He introduced to the press his choice for running mate, 41-year-old Senator Dan Quayle of Indiana, and he stressed his family values, as well as the fact that he represents the baby boom generation at the tender age of 41. Tonight, I had an opportunity to talk with Senator Quayle about his new life as the vice presidential pick of the Republican Party.
Well, Tom, the lights are a lot brighter, the scrutiny's a lot tougher, and all of a sudden, when my mother and father arrived, my father told me, he says, I really didn't know if this was going to be any different until I got down here and saw all the Secret Service and all the hoopla, and he says, this is different. It is.
Let me ask you about how the vice president presented you today. He stressed especially your youthful energy, the generation that you represent, and your family values. There's a lot of talk during the course of this campaign about family values. Do you think that the family values of Dan Quayle and George Bush are superior to those of Mike Dukakis and Lloyd Bentsen?
I believe that Dan Quayle and George Bush have the very first commitment to trying to preserve family values, trying to keep families together. We know the importance of a family. We know what happens when families break up. We know what happens when you have, or when you don't have a family. A family is very important, particularly to the children.
But do you think it's any different on the Democratic side? Don't you think that they feel the same way about that issue? Is it kind of a non-issue this year?
I don't believe it's a non-issue, and particularly in one of the disputes we're going to get into, like the child care. What best way to provide for the children? The Democrats, Dukakis and Bentsen, have an approach where you're going to get the federal government involved, federal regulations. The federal government's going to start to dictate what the family looks like. Our approach is entirely different. We want to put as much money as possible into the parent's hand, let the parent make the choice of what kind of child care that child needs. We place a far more premium on the child. They're looking at government intervention to really try to create a family-type environment, which we don't think is right.
Republicans have a lot of hopes that you can close the gender gap for Vice President George Bush. Let me ask you about that. You've done well among female voters in Indiana, but it's going to be different, as you well know, when you go nationally. For example, you're opposed to abortion in any form. You also have opposed the ERA, and you're opposed to increasing the minimum wage, which is important to a lot of women out there. Aren't you going to have a hard time selling Dan Quayle to the women of the country outside of your home state of Indiana?
No, I won't. I'll tell you what, very many women and men, but particularly I think women are very sensitive to the issue of education. They are very sensitive to the issue of job training. Dan Quayle wrote the Job Training Partnership Act in 1982. My co-author was Ted Kennedy. We did it on a bipartisan basis, but that Job Training Partnership Act reached out, touched millions of people that didn't have a job. We also are very involved in education, and these are some of the issues, I believe, that shows a very broad base that I operate from.
But they care a lot about getting some assistance for abortion if they are involved in a rape or the victims of incest, and this platform rules against that.
I believe the abortion issue cuts both ways. Men are divided on the issue, the women are divided on the issue. And I don't believe that is the cutting issue on where you're going to go out and to get a broad coalition. I believe what you're going to look at is how we're going to provide for opportunity. How you're going to provide for that child's education. Think of what it costs to educate a child today that is born today. A child born today, the costs at a minimum are going to be $100,000 by the time they go to higher education. That's really mind-boggling.
Senator, you seem to have trouble with a couple of questions today at a news conference. The business about you joining the National Guard in 1969, where many members of your generation were going off to Vietnam. Your mother was quoted as saying today that you were opposed to Vietnam at that time. Is that true, and did you join the Guard so you wouldn't have to go to Vietnam?
No, I did have some questions about the way that the war in Vietnam was conducted. History has certainly been a very important lesson to show that if we're going to get involved in something, we ought to have a goal and a requirement. We didn't in Vietnam. Now, the reason I joined the National Guard is because I wanted to have service in the armed forces. The National Guard, in my judgment, is a very good group. Millions of people are involved in the National Guard. And if my Indiana unit would have been called up, like other Indiana units, to go to Vietnam, I would have gone with that unit very proudly and served in Vietnam.
A lot of National Guards in a lot of states are tough to get into. Did you have to have any help getting into the Guard at a time when the draft was heated up and a lot of people were volunteering for the branches of the service?
I was very interested in getting into the National Guard. There's no doubt about it. I wanted to get into the National Guard. And I was fortunate enough to get into the National Guard.
But you didn't require any special help of any kind to get in at that time?
But, I mean, special help of any kind. I mean, I let a number of people know that I wanted to get into the National Guard.
And so they probably help you get in. Is that what you're saying? I don't quite understand.
Okay, let me tell you. You're going back 20 years.
Right.
And exactly 20 years ago, who I said I'd like to get into the National Guard if phone calls were made, I can't answer that. I don't know the specifics of that. The only thing I know is I did want to get into the National Guard. I was proud. I'm very proud of my service in the National Guard, and there are millions of people in America that are very proud of their service in the National Guard, whether it's the Indiana National Guard, the Alabama National Guard, California National Guard.
Paula Parkinson, the lobbyist who went to Florida and spent a couple of nights in a Florida condominium where you had been with some of your pals on a golfing vacation. You have said repeatedly you left the next day after she arrived, and others have said that you were not in any way involved in some of the questionable activity that was going on. Why don't you just say that today?
Look, you know the facts of that situation, and you know that Dan Quayle had absolutely nothing to do with it. We didn't, and that's the end of the story.
And you don't expect it to come up again and again?
Well, I mean, people can keep bringing it up, but why? That we've gone over this, and there's nothing there. And I think you know it.
Senator, when you're the vice president, if you're elected, you'll be just a heartbeat away from the Oval Office. If something like the Iran-Contra affair comes up, and there's a meeting of the president's closest advisors, as vice president, would you just say this is a crazy harebrained scheme of some kind?
I would offer my private advice to the president on a scheme that I thought was harebrained or anything else. You've got to understand, and particularly in my generation, that we are independent. We've been called, I think, somewhat critically, the me generation. We're used to having our way. But my role as vice president is, first of all, to support the president and his policies. But believe me, and George Bush knows this because he's got children about my age, that I am going to be giving my untarnished advice to him in private.
Senator Quayle, thanks very much for coming by tonight. Good luck.
Thank you. I'll need it.
41-year-old Dan Quayle, who will be the vice presidential nominee of this party, his son, one of his sons, 12-year-old Tucker, came down here today from Indiana, looked around, wasn't too sure about all this, said at dinner tonight, Dad, you can still get out of this. You don't have to accept the nomination. But he is going to do just that, accept the nomination. We'll be back with more from New Orleans right after this.
Decision 88, America's Conventions, is sponsored in part by Kellogg's Just Right. No other cereal is just right. And by GE, from aircraft engines to appliances, we bring good things to life. And by Merrill Lynch, an investment firm built on a tradition of trust. And by Ford and your Ford dealer. Have you driven a Ford lately?
Traffic 2 over.
The Ford Tempo GLS.
A sophisticated sports sedan with true feel-of-the-road handling. Ford Tempo GLS. A sleek example of design leadership. It's a more sophisticated way to express your driving ambition.
Now get a $400 cash bonus on Ford Tempo.
How can investors profit from today's changing market?
Merrill Lynch was quick to recognize a major change in our economy, the Industrial Renaissance. Exports are growing strongly, and that means a rise in orders for American capital goods and an excellent opportunity to profit from the rebuilding of our nation's basic industries. Where there is indecision among the cautious, there is opportunity for the selective, and we're ready to make specific recommendations.
Merrill Lynch, a tradition of trust.
Guy runs a big customer service operation, tons of paperwork, and he's having trouble. Stuff getting his file, customers getting mad, so forth. So I took him out to Tewksbury to show him how WIS is doing the job in their own customer service operation. Customer calls, I bring up a photocopy of his file. Get his credit information from the mainframe, same workstation. All on WIS, Wang's integrated image system. Guy scribbles a note, hands it to my secretary. She scans it, up it comes on the screen in his own handwriting. Get me a pilot system.
Seeing is believing, huh?
Wang's integrated image system is the next big step.
This is what I wonder. If this is just right, how can that one be just right? I mean, here they have fruit and nuts with all those flakes, and there they have fiber nuggets, huh? So this isn't just a little better, or maybe it's a little worse. It's just right, just like the other one. Hey, they both taste great and they give you all those vitamins, but the thing is they're doing it in different ways. So they may both seem just right, but it's just not physically possible.
Kellogg's Just Right. For the perfect blend of 100% nutrition and great taste, no other cereal is just right.
Of course, I've been wrong before.
George Bush has practically all the delegates who are assembled down here tonight, so his nomination is absolutely secure, a shoo-in. But nonetheless, many members of his staff are on this floor just in case any little fires break out along the way. One of them is his quiet but effective chief of staff. His name is Craig Fuller, and he's down on that floor right now with Lisa Myers. Lisa?
Hi, Tom. Yes, I am here with Craig Fuller. Craig, in an interview just a few moments ago, Dan Quayle has said that he may have made a few telephone calls to help him get into the National Guard. Were you aware of that when you selected him to be vice president?
You know, that process of evaluating his military record was left up to others. We think he's got a good record. We're pleased with this selection. We don't think it's going to be an issue.
If it is proven that he did use his political connections to help get into the Guard, would that pose a political problem?
You know, I think it's too soon to jump to any kind of a conclusion. Dan Quayle is a fine individual. He's a patriotic individual. There have been a lot of people in the National Guard who have served their country well, and this is not something that at this point we're concerned about.
Were you aware that Dan Quayle, as his mother has said, opposed the Vietnam War?
I'm not sure what his mother said today. This is somebody we have a lot of confidence in, a lot of faith in, and we think we'll campaign well with him across the country.
Well, he has also said that he did oppose the Vietnam War. Were you aware of that?
You know, Dan Quayle is somebody that has got a lot of his own views. He's someone that is very compatible with George Bush, and I think we'll go about this campaign and let those issues come out if they in fact exist.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Now back to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Lisa Myers. What we're not entirely clear about is why Dan Quayle may have had some opposition to the Vietnam War, whether he was opposed to the idea of war generally, or the conservative view then is that we weren't executing that war in the proper fashion, that there was no fixed goal and we weren't going after it in a full-hearted or full-throated way. That was the view of many people who were on the conservative side of the political ledger in those days. He has said to us only that he had some questions about the goals in Vietnam. At the podium right now, or just off the podium, is NBC's Connie Chung with one of the thousands of members of the George Bush family who are gathered here to help their father get this nomination and to share in this joyous moment with him. Connie?
Thank you, Tom. I am here with George Bush Jr., the eldest son of George and Barbara Bush. George, just a moment ago, Tom Brokaw, in an interview with Dan Quayle, Dan Quayle revealed that he may have made a few phone calls that would help him get into the National Guard instead of serving in Vietnam. Are you aware of this, and do you think that could be a problem?
I'm not, no, and I also think service in the National Guard is a good thing to do. I mean, I'm from that era, as you know. As a matter of fact, he happens to be 1 year younger than I am. He could have gone to Canada. he decided to serve. I think Dan Quayle ought to be proud of his National Guard experience, like thousands of others around the country are. I was in the National Guard.
You were in the National Guard.
I flew fighters in the Texas Air National Guard, of which I am very proud.
Now, the problem, though, would be is if indeed he made several phone calls or some people made phone calls on his behalf to get him into the National Guard. Did that happen to you?
No, I don't think so. But in those days, people were going into the service, all different branches. And people, if you want to go in the National Guard, I guess sometimes people made calls. I don't see anything wrong with it. As a matter of fact, I'm glad he served his country. And serving in the National Guard is serving in the military. They probably should have called the National Guard up in those days. Maybe we'd have done better in Vietnam.
All right. Now, tonight will be a big night, not only, of course, for your father, but for you yourself. You will be, when the roll call occurs,
right?
Texas will be called upon. You will stand up, and for 15 seconds, you will put your father over the top in winning this nomination. Do you have a memorable 15 seconds to offer this assembled crowd?
No, I don't. But I've got 15 seconds. I'll be able to get through it. And for me personally, and I hope for my dad, who I love dearly, it's a moment we both won't forget. I'm looking forward to it. We've worked hard to get to this spot, and it's a big night for him, and I'm just fortunate enough to share it with him.
All right. Thank you very much. George Bush, Jr., who will put his father over the top when the roll call occurs. And thank you.
Thanks, Connie.
Thank you, Connie and Ms. Bush. Appreciate it. One of the major issues that we'll all be dealing with this fall, of course, will be the whole question of foreign policy and national security affairs. It's something that Ronald Reagan has built a large part of his presidency on. What will be the future under George Bush if he were to be elected president of the United States? It is one of those cutting issues that will come before us all in the fall campaign. We want to talk about that some tonight in this convention hall. We'll begin now with NBC's Ken Bodie, who's down there with a rather familiar face in that subject area.
Tom, Secretary of State, former Secretary of State, and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, looking tanned and just as popular as ever with Republicans. He's signing autographs in this hall. Tell us, Dan Quayle today, Dr. Kissinger, told all of us at the press conference, that one of his major accomplishments is that he's one of the leading experts in America in national security affairs. You are also. Tell us what you know about Dan Quayle's expertise.
Well, I got to know him about 2 or 3 years ago in the context of national security. He got in touch with me to check out some of his ideas, and he sent me his speeches and his papers, and he was doing a paper, for example, on the spread of missiles to various countries, which I thought was an extremely professional job. And then in the context of testimony I made before congressional committees on the treaties, I thought he was one of the best informed senators on national security affairs that I know.
What issues exactly has he demonstrated leadership in the Senate?
Well, I can only judge his knowledge on foreign policy and national security questions.
He sent you papers for you to read.
He sent me papers, and I had discussions with him on those issues, and I thought that he was very sophisticated on
this. This sounds like a tutorial.
No, it sounds like an exchange of ideas, and he was unusually well informed in the areas that we discussed, which dealt mostly with national security issues and arms control and negotiations with the Soviets.
How would you characterize his views on arms control?
I think he was wary of some of the specific proposals that were being made. He made some very professional analyses of the impact of some proposals on the actual disposition of American forces unless those forces were changed. And he had some concerns about some of the interpretations that might be made of various provisions of various agreements. All of which is highly technical, but was very sophisticated.
I hate to interrupt you, Professor, but we have to go to Chris Wallace, and thank you very much.
Nice to see you.
Thanks, Ken. One foreign policy issue that may hurt the Republicans this fall is the White House's problems with Panama's Manuel Noriega. And no one has been a bigger critic of that policy than the Republican senator from New York, Alphonse D'Amato. Senator, all Mike Dukakis has to do is quote your speeches because you say the White House has totally mishandled the Panama policy.
Well, we have. The fact of the matter is that here is a drug dealer who is suppressing people, who we've indicted, and we have done little but embarrassed this country. We've made all kinds of threats. We've crushed the Panamanian people with an economic boycott, and we haven't done what we should.
So, Senator, when George Bush talks about Michael Dukakis' inexperience in foreign policy, isn't it fair game for Dukakis to talk about Bush's experience in Panama, his experience in selling arms to the Ayatollah?
Let me say this. I think it's fair to say that this is an unfinished matter, and I would hope that this administration administration would finish it. And that means take Manuel Noriega and his cronies from power. And we can do it. And it doesn't mean a full-scale invasion, but we've got to follow through on the real program. We're vulnerable on it.
I was going to say, I mean, it's a big applause line for Mike Dukakis out on the stump.
Mike Dukakis does not offer the kind of constructive alternatives. I haven't heard them. I haven't seen them. And certainly retreat in Central America is not the answer.
Alphonse D'Amato, thanks very much. Senator D'Amato, who has criticized the White House on this Panama issue, and says Mike Dukakis it will also. Tom?
Thank you very much, Ken Bodie. Ken Bodie and Chris Wallace, who are down there on the floor talking about foreign policy. NBC's commentator, John Chancellor, has been watching all of this, of course, and he's with us tonight. John, your thoughts. We saw Dan Quayle earlier today get his baptism by fire. I mean, that's the best way to describe it. He was at a news conference. You watched it. You were there. And tonight he was on here. And one of the big questions before, not just this assembly, of course, but before the country, is he well qualified to be just a heartbeat away from the Oval Office?
Well, Tom, I'm going to take an unorthodox position here. I think a lot of foreign policy experience is irrelevant. It is not the first priority for a vice president. I think a vice president a heartbeat away needs to have character and toughness and intelligence and integrity. Harry Truman was never told about the atomic bomb in the 1940s by Franklin Roosevelt. He was the vice president. They cut him out of the loop completely. He came in, and because he was a tough and intelligent and steadfast vice president, he was an outstanding president in foreign affairs because he had, it seems to me, the basic qualities that go into understanding and leading in foreign affairs, and those are far deeper than a knowledge of which missile is pointed at another missile or what subsection of some treaty says. And you see a lot of politicians, and you'll see some on the Democratic and Republican side this year pretending that because they know the minutia, they know the big picture. And it's not necessarily true. Senator Quayle has had some excellent committee assignments. He does know something about this. But I submit that what we ought to be looking for, especially at this stage of the game, is he a good man?
The fact of the matter is that he's had more experience than Richard Nixon had when he was picked to run with Dwight Eisenhower, and he's older. More experience than Harry Truman in terms of where he was, or the same kind of experience. He is a little younger than John Kennedy when he ran for president of the United States, after all. And Walter Mondale, who'd been in the Senate a long time, had no more executive experience than did Dan Quayle when that was raised before him today as well.
Nor was John F. Kennedy a great scholar of foreign affairs himself back in the 1960 election.
But what I don't understand is why someone like Dan Quayle just doesn't say something like that.
Because journalists get to say that. Politicians have to pretend they know everything. And sometimes I think it gets them into trouble. But if you look at these two tickets, now that we put them together, on foreign affairs, the Republicans have more experience and more smarts, including Senator Benson, who's been in the Senate a long time.
All right, if we have a moment here, I'd like to read you a small poem from a political observer. His name is Muhammad Ali, about what's going to happen come the fall. He says, "So follow the polls for amusement and fun, but remember they're just an opinion and everyone's got one. Then on November 8th, it really shouldn't shock us when Bush beats Dukakis." That's the prediction of Muhammad Ali. We'll be back with more after this.
On a summer's evening in 1924, perhaps the most significant game in the history of baseball was played. What made the game truly historic was the time of day, nightfall. For on that night, a band of GE engineers ushered in the era of night baseball. Baseball under the lights, making possible for us all the many brilliant nights to come.
To write the words and make the plans that bring the future inside. To show the world it can see its dreams, see them in all.
From originals to copies, on screen or on paper, what you see is what we do. Team Xerox. Leadership in document processing with machines and systems that make output outstanding.
We document the world.
Susan, can we talk?
Sure, Dad.
You notice anything different about Mom?
She's acting pretty wild for her age.
Well, I don't just mean the roller skates.
And the motor scooter. She even borrowed my new dress. Come on, Dad, what is it?
A balanced diet with the right vitamin nutrition helps people get more out of life. Some are finding Kellogg's Product 19. 100% of 12 vitamins and minerals. Feel good about yourself.
Not the, rubber dress.
Feel like 19 again.
Even in the world's most beautiful playgrounds, things don't always go so beautifully. But that's okay as long as you have Visa Gold. Because we'll not only help you get a doctor, a lawyer for anything you need, we'll deliver a new Visa Gold and emergency cash to anywhere you are, anywhere in the world. And emergency cash is something American Express just can't deliver. Visa Gold, it's everywhere you want to be.
NBC News convention coverage from the Louisiana Superdome will continue in a moment.
Sunday, one general will shape him, and one cadet will try to break him until the day...
You hate me, don't you?
He happens.
Yes, I do.
To die.
I am the suspect. How did you kill him? You cannot have a murder without a murderer, can you?
Dress gray.
Citibank is about to show you a whole new way to handle your banking. It's a touch of the future. Citibank Success Machine, the new generation of banking machines. No other bank has them. Welcome to the future. Citibank, when, where, and how to succeed.
Winner of 9 Academy Awards. The most honored film in 25 years. The best picture of 1988. An adventure like this comes along only once in 10,000 years. The Last Emperor, coming soon on video cassette.
Right now is a great time to pick up a great deal on a Nissan hardbody truck, because Nissan dealers are closing out the 88s with dirt cheap prices on 4x4s, king cabs, two-wheel drives, even hardbody specials. It's also your last chance to get up to $700 cash back, including cash back from the dealer.
Yonkers off the hook temporarily on News 4.
NBC News convention coverage continues. Here is Tom Brokaw in the Louisiana Superdome.
Well, we're back, and this crowd, this is a good time night for them. They get to nominate their choice for President of the United States. That's George Bush. No heavy lifting on this occasion. He gets nominated tonight by Phil Gramm, the senator from Texas, big state. Of course, he'll play an important part of the campaign come this fall with all of its electoral votes, so they want to give Texas its due. It's George Bush's adopted home state. He'll go over the top when we get to Texas in the roll call. But before we get there, we want to check in on what's happening around the edges of the Bush campaign and the Dan Quayle entrance onto the scene. Let's go to the Bush headquarters now. NBC's Dennis Murphy is there. Dennis, what are you hearing there?
Well, the vice president is out of the hotel now, Tom. He had a very nice dinner, we're told, down at Arnaud's, a fancy restaurant here in the French Quarter. He's going to be going upstairs to the suite, and he's going to watch the roll call vote on television, watch his son, George Bush Jr., put him over the top, as we've said. And Barbara Bush will be coming back over from the hall to join him. Not a great deal more to be said at this point, Tom. The speech is the thing. We've said that to the point of being tiresome, probably, but it is the most important event coming up this week for George Bush. He's comfortable with the words. He's had a chance to rehearse it many times now. And there was kind of an exuberant feel, I thought, to the vice president today. Starting this morning, you know, he went over to the hall, and that podium that you see behind you has a kind of hydraulic lift. It goes up and down. George Bush was riding it and having great fun with it. It was a kind of toy. So he feels confident, upbeat, and his people thought he had a good day at that news conference with Quayle. They thought he looked presidential and in command. So I think they're feeling pretty upbeat around here, Tom.
Thank you very much, Dennis Murphy. And, of course, the big task for the Bush operatives here tonight is to define this ticket in their terms. He's no longer the second banana to Ronald Reagan. He's got to emerge from this convention hall at the end of this week as a commanding, authoritative, indeed presidential figure, and he hopes to get some help in all of that from Dan Quayle today. And in fact, when George Bush did appear with this much younger man, it did give him a stature that you often don't see when he appears with Ronald Reagan, who is such a commanding presence on any stage. NBC's Tom Pettit has been watching the Quayle campaign. They're joined hip and thigh now, the Quayle and the Bush forces, but whether or not that transplant has taken completely is an open question. How's the staffing and all the other stuff going on, Pettit?
Tom, obviously there are problems in starting up a totally new national campaign from scratch with no more notice than they had. Here's the senior staff assessment of how it's going. They view that Quayle did well at the press conference, that he's a fast study, but he does not yet talk in sound bites. They want to teach him how to do that. There's an enormous problem with their press operation. In their words, it's a mess. They're going to hire a new press secretary, David Prosperi of the Interior Department. They think the Secret Service helps Dan Quayle's campaign because it handles all the logistics. Otherwise, there would be no Dan Quayle campaign right now. Otherwise, the vice president spent about 4 or 5 hours with Dan Quayle, some of it watching television, the rest of it briefing him on how it is to be in national politics. One final comment. The senior staffer said, Quayle makes Bush look good. Tom?
And that's a very important part of the consideration when he is picked, obviously. Earlier tonight, there's a little buzz on the floor about all of this, we're now told. Dan Quayle has been saying that when he joined the National Guard back in 1969, when many members of his generation were going off to Vietnam, he was very interested in doing that, and he probably made some calls to help himself get in, but he can't recall just who it is that he asked for that assistance. In many states, it is difficult to get into the National Guard, a potentially sensitive area, of course, for the ticket, because military affairs is an important part of the equation for the Republicans, and standing tall. George Bush was a World War II hero. That's out and around now. It may be out and around deliberately on the part of the Bush forces so that they can deal with it tonight. They do have their people down on the floor addressing it, saying, listen, he's a patriotic young man. You heard George Bush Jr. say that he served in the Texas National Guard during that same era, flew jet planes for them at that time. The Vice President's family now assembled in the VIP box here in the Superdome. There's Mrs. Bush in a bright blue polka dot dress, one of her grandchildren. Beside her there, to the left, is John Tower, and to her immediate left is, well, she got up and left. That's Marilyn Quayle, just now waving with the pearls. She met Dan Quayle when they were both in law school, and they've been married since that time. And I believe that those are probably the senior Quayles, the parents. We talked with them yesterday. He's a small-town newspaper publisher. Comes from a prominent newspaper family, the Quayles do. They own Arizona Republic and the Indianapolis Star and newspapers. It's a privately held company worth an awful lot of money. Exactly how much we're unclear. But they were a little surprised to have to make hurried arrangements to get down here to join their son so that he could become the vice presidential nominee. That's Mrs. Bush is kind of a free spirit. And there's Helen Hayes, you can see with the glasses on as well, Chuck Heston. But Mrs. Bush is kind of a free spirit. She kind of likes to say what she has on her mind, and she's totally devoted and dedicated to George Bush, and she said last night that she would do anything that she could to protect his health. Let's go to the podium now and see what's happening there. This is the senator from Kansas who was nominated, who was on a long list of prospective nominees for the vice presidential slot, Nancy Kassebaum, Kansas, daughter of Alf Landon. Once carried the banner for this party. There may be a little spread. This has been so tightly scripted and buttoned up, this Republican Party convention. They may now, we're told, have some fun. They may have Nancy Kassebaum in some form or another introduce Dan Quayle, who is in the hall tonight, so that these delegates can get their first real convention hall look at him. Let's listen to Nancy Kassebaum.
Mr. Chairman, fellow delegates and honored guests, we are frequently, Mr. Chairman,
drummer doesn't get an audience like this every day, and he wants to take full advantage of it.
I've seen a number of things that you mentioned, but for certain drummers.
That's Marilyn Quayle. Earlier tonight, her husband told me that she's quite outspoken. He said that she was telling someone the other day that she's different than other Senate wives. She said, I'm antisocial and I have some intelligence. And he said, I don't think that the other Senate wives are going to like that kind of comparison. And then he talked about how they are a much different group these days. 3 of the Senate wives are lawyers, as she is. Manning Harmon, who's been conducting these Republican Party orchestras for a long, long time, is obviously in a fill period. They're probably trying to find Dan Quayle somewhere. This is Bob Michael, who's trying to get some order.
Join me in welcoming a very special guest who'll be seated with Barbara Bush and Marilyn Quayle, the next Vice President of the United States, Senator Dan Quayle of Indiana.
Dan Quayle's father had to run down to the cleaners and get his one summer suit out of the cleaners so that he could arrive here in time to witness this triumphant entry of his son into the convention hall. Henderson, Indiana, town of 16,000 population. Newspaper there, which the Quayles run, smaller newspaper than the family owns in Indianapolis, and Phoenix has a circulation of about 10,000. Vice President emphasized repeatedly today that this is a great campaigner, a young man with a lot of energy. He is 41 years old. The Vice President said there's a big difference between us. I'm 64, he's 41. He represents the future of this party. Right on all the positions as far as the conservatives are concerned. Abortion, SDI, aid to the Contras. Member of the Senate Armed Services Committee as well. And it's fair to say a surprise choice for most of the political pros in the Republican Party.
Would the convention please come to order? We have a distinguished message ahead.
Charlton Heston said the Pledge of Allegiance.
Would the convention come in order for the distinguished senator from Kansas, Nancy Kassebaum.
Welcome, Mr. Vice President-to-be.
Gets the embrace of the short but politically astute John Tower. We'll be back with more right after this.
No, take the last one. I can make another batch.
Kellogg's Rice Krispies Treats. You can whip up a chewy no-bake batch in minutes. However, nobody has to know that but you.
I know how you love them, so I don't mind the work.
Besides, Rice Krispies Treats certainly taste like somebody slaved over them.
Really? It's no bother.
Rice Krispies Treats. So good, it's hard to believe how easy they are.
It's worth any amount of trouble, as long as it makes you happy.
Since the beginning of the '88 model year, Ford's sales leadership over the second best-selling truck line has been stacking up at a terrific rate. Maybe it's because Ford trucks have been the best-built American trucks for 8 straight years. Or because Ford has the highest percentage of repeat buyers of any full line of light trucks. Or because they've been the best-selling trucks in America for the past 3 years. Whatever. If you stacked up Ford's current lead over the second-place truck, 150,000, the Fords would actually reach all the way up to the Space Shuttle's orbit. That's leadership. Built Ford tough.
Our plan is to get phones everywhere, even here.
Somewhere over the rainbow.
The system is great. We can talk to computers anywhere.
At AT&T, we've always been committed to helping the people of the world communicate better. Funny how the future seems to repeat itself.
Yes, we can put all this knowledge into everybody's home or office at the push of a button.
And the dreams that you dare to dream really do come true.
What are you doing, kid?
Just reading, sir.
Oh, what are you reading?
A research report.
I thought Mr. Merrill wrote those for our clients.
Mr. Merrill wrote this?
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty good.
Hey, what do you know, big shot? Our job is to mail them, not read them.
Well, Tim, if I don't read them, how'll I ever get out of the mailroom?
Charlie Merrill believed in doing his homework. It's how he built the business. It's why Merrill Lynch is #1 in research today. Merrill Lynch, a tradition of trust.
We're back, and momentarily we'll be hearing from Senator Bob Dole, who was the runner-up both in the presidential sweepstakes and, if you believe what we've been hearing from the Bush campaign, also in the vice presidential sweepstakes. At least he was told yesterday that he was one of the 2 finalists, but the final nod went to Dan Quayle, the vice president's choice there. Bob Dole is an enormously popular figure and also, at the same time, controversial in the Republican Party and in American politics. He's just now being introduced by his fellow Kansas Senator, Nancy Kassebaum. He'll be talking here tonight. A lot of people want to know what he has to say about what he'll be doing this fall. One of the things he'd like to do is to get a Republican majority back in the U.S. Senate so he can be the majority leader again. Wounded in World War II. Lost the use of his right arm.
Thank you very much.
A quick and cutting man with a great sense of humor, which has often been his undoing.
Thank you very much.
I'm going inside, please.
Thank you very much. Hey, Al. Thank you very much. I accept the nomination as Majority Leader of the United States Senate. Let me underscore my priorities for 1988. First of all, I am committed to electing George Bush President of the United States in November. I am committed to electing Republicans to Congress. So tonight I am asking you to help us strengthen our party in the House and to help us regain the majority in the United States Senate. I am ready and eager to serve as George Bush's point man in a Republican-controlled Senate come January. And I promise to beat back any Democratic schemes to raise your taxes or any effort to weaken our national defense. Let me congratulate my colleague, Dan Quayle, our next vice president. I talked to Dan yesterday. I called to congratulate him. I interrupted him. He was shaving for the first time. And I can say to my friends all across America, I'm proud to have been his leader in the United States Senate. He is young, he's dynamic, he's articulate, and he's already had 12 years' experience in Congress. If only the Democratic nominee had had half as much, we would be in a stronger position. This year's election represents a crossroads for America. The alternatives have never been more obvious, or the consequences more important. The issues will be defense and deficits and détente and drugs. But the bottom line question is, what kind of country will America be as it enters a new century? Will we be truly strong or barely strong enough? Will we be self-confident or self-doubting? Will we be on the march or at a standstill? Strength and security. The founding fathers saw these two words as an essential link between them 200 years ago. And we Republicans see it today. We are secure as individuals only when the country we live in is strong and confident. And when our country is weak and uncertain and lacking in will, we are all vulnerable. The link between the strength of our nation and the security of our people seems obvious. But there are always some, and there are some out there now who never seem to get the picture. These people, the liberal doomsayers, believe America cannot be trusted. They believe that the disarming of America is a noble goal. They do not understand that America must be strong if America is to be free. We understand, all of us in this hall, in this party, and across the country. And of course, George Bush understands. And George Bush has understood for a long, long time the importance of freedom. But the Democratic nominee does not. He is undoubtedly a fine man. He did an excellent job in gaining his party's nomination. He will work hard between now and November. But unfortunately, he is one of those liberals who does not know where to draw the line, and this puts America at risk. He seems willing to throw away the Monroe Doctrine. He says he can live with Soviet client states in Central America. Oh yes, he speaks Spanish freely on the campaign trail, but he is not concerned whether Spanish-speaking people in Central America have the right to be free, and that's the difference. The governor is one of those liberals who is suspicious of America's strength, embarrassed when America asserts its rights, uncomfortable when America stands on the side of freedom. One of those liberals who knocks our president, questions his principles, and assails his policies. One of those liberals who suffers a sudden lapse of memory when it comes to the outrages of the Ayatollah, Colonel Gaddafi, Comandante Ortega, and other third world tyrants. One of those liberals with strange ideas, cockeyed ideas. Yes, cockeyed ideas. Cockeyed ideas about the way the world works. And think about the last time this kind of liberal occupied the White House. Think about the 4 years of malaise and mismanagement, of disaster. Think about all the countries that fell into the Soviet orbit. Think about Cambodia, where Marxism led to genocide. And think about Ethiopia, where Marxism led to famine. And Nicaragua, where Marxism has led to a Soviet beachhead in the Americas. And think about all these places where the liberals did not know where or how to draw the line. And then think about Grenada, where Ronald Reagan and George Bush did draw the line and where its people now have a democracy. Think about Libya, where Reagan and Bush drew the line, and they silenced the terrorists. And think about Afghanistan, where by drawing the line, this administration, Ronald Reagan and George Bush, helped a courageous people survive and kept alive their dreams of freedom. And think about Angola. And because we backed the freedom fighters in Angola, a negotiated settlement is possible that could result in the departure of 40,000 Cuban mercenaries. And yes, think about the Persian Gulf. Think about the Persian Gulf, because we insisted, you insisted, that the American Navy should draw a line protecting freedom of the seas. And because of that, the end of the Iran-Iraq war is in sight. Now I ask you this question: would this have happened if the liberals had been in the White House? Would there have been an improvement in relations with Moscow and an INF treaty? You got it right both times. And you're right, and I'll tell you why. Because these liberals define arms control this way: the Soviets arm while we control. And liberals like the Massachusetts governor never get the picture. They fail to understand that a strong America keeps the peace and a weak America invites danger. Harry Truman understood where to draw the line in 1947, and because he did, Greece is a free nation today. John F. Kennedy understood where to draw the line in 1962, and because he did, the Soviet missiles were yanked out of Cuba. And those kind of mainstream Democrats who still believe in a strong national defense are now outcasts in their own party. And today's liberals, led by Jesse Jackson and Michael Dukakis, will never understand. They don't have a clue. For them, it's always mourning in America, mourning with a U, a time to mourn America's recovery, a time to mourn America's strength, a time to mourn America's new sense of purpose. But on the other hand, George Bush understands that strength and freedom are two sides of the same coin. And as a young pilot, he risked his life for his country in the skies of the Pacific. As Ronald Reagan stated Monday evening, he has helped give this country 8 of the best years it has ever had. That's why I'm proud of George Bush. That's why George Bush is going to be elected in November of this year. And George Bush and Dan Quayle support SDI because it provides defense against the accidents that cause war, and this keeps the peace. He supports the B-1 bomber and the stealth bomber and the MX and the Midget-Man missiles because they deter aggression, and this too keeps the peace. George Bush and Dan Quayle support freedom fighters around the world. And what does the Democratic candidate support? What programs to keep America truly strong and free? Let me list them for you. I haven't lost my place. I just can't think of any. There's got to be one out there somewhere. His idea of national defense is one if by land and 2 if by sea, if you can get through the polluted waters of Boston Harbor. In the world, according to the Massachusetts liberal, defending liberty is dangerous and it costs too much. But there's a real world out there where America must provide real leadership. In the world, according to the Massachusetts liberal, America should get an okay first from the United Nations before we ever do anything. But there's a real world out there. And sometimes America must act on its own to protect our interests and your interest and your children's interests. According to the Massachusetts liberal.
Senator Bob Dole delivering a real stem winder here tonight to this convention hall where he had hoped to be standing as the presidential candidate, but instead, of course, he'll return to the U.S. Senate from Kansas as the Republican leader. He hopes after this fall, the Republicans once again will have the majority returned to them. But at this time, practically speaking, at the congressional level, that remains a slim hope at best for them. We'll be back with more on this night that they nominate George Bush. We'll have the roll call of the states and much, much more right after this.
GE is a family of many different kinds of people, and while it may not look like it, they all have the same job, bringing good things to life.
We are the spark in the engine, the switch in the night, a voice in the dark from a million miles away. We are the beams and the splash, the splish and the flash. We are GE, we are the good things you hear and see. We are GE, we are the sound of surprise, and the whisper in the sky. We are GE, that's what we'll always be. We are the good things, we are GE, we bring good things to life.
Some people are so silly. Ouch. They make this big deal about Kellogg's Frosted Flakes being just for kids. Well, look at me. I'm an adult. I eat them. Heck, I love them. Frosted Flakes just for kids? Come on. Like we adults have to go sneaking around. Like we can't enjoy these sweet, crunchy flakes just as much as kids.
Daddy, are you eating our Frosted Flakes again?
Oops. There now. You can't deny it. Frosted Flakes have the taste adults have grown to love. They're great.
Once more.
An employee pension fund, 1,000 phone calls a day through voice processing on the Wang VS computer. The VS accesses an IBM 4381, voice access, Wang Office, WP Plus, COBOL for 71 pension administrators online.
So the mainframe's operating as a file server?
Yeah, we do all the integration. That's our edge.
Voice, data, word, networking, human factors?
Human factors?
Real people. When they pick up the phone, they're integrated. Integration's key.
Good point. So I'll open with the...
Wait 1 second. I thought I was opening.
NBC News convention coverage from the Louisiana Superdome will continue in a moment.
And let me tell you, I was impressed.
It takes insight and intelligence, fairness and control to go one-on-one with the leaders of the world. Tom Brokaw, only on NBC.
I really don't know how much better it can get.
It's faster.
I really like them.
It's excellent.
Introducing the Citibank Success Machines.
Because it does everything I'm looking for in banking.
Touch the screen and it tells you everything you want to know.
I can transfer between accounts, deposit cash, checks, make payments, or just get cash.
I can come in and do whatever I want to do on the machine.
You walk up, you do it, you're out, and that's it.
I love it. It's really neat.
The Citibank Success Machines. No other bank has them. Citibank. When, where, and how to succeed.
In 1985, Michigan was faced with a modern-day nightmare. The possible failure of one of its largest power companies. The problem was the enormous cost of completing a controversial nuclear power plant. After spending $4 billion, the plant still eluded completion. The dilemma drove consumers' power out of the black and could have forced millions of people into the dark. In 1986, working with Drexel Burnham, a new management team at Consumers Power decided to fuel the plant with natural gas. And the power for Michigan's continued progress will stay on, thanks to Drexel Burnham's $1.7 billion restructuring of the project. Proof that innovative thinking is not just good for business, but for everyone. Drexel Burnham, financing America's future.
Arrests in last night's killing of a cop on News 4.
NBC News convention coverage continues. Here is Tom Brokaw in the Louisiana Superdome.
We're back. This convention hall has just heard from Senator Bob Dole, who tried and failed to win the presidential nomination, but he's not lost his quick wit. He refers to the Democratic ticket, that's Mike Dukakis and Lloyd Benson, as Benson and Hedges, because he says that Mike Dukakis hedges his position on almost every issue. Down there on the floor right now with Chris Wallace is someone who has prospered enormously during the years of Reaganomics. Chris Wallace, who do you have?
Well, that's right, Tom. One of the interesting things about any national convention is the surprising people who show up on the floor, and here tonight is real estate tycoon and best-selling author Donald Trump.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome. You have flirted with the idea of politics. Now you're here at your first national convention. Does that get you interested in possibly making the plunge?
Now you have to tell me something. Who told you I flirted?
Well,
I didn't know that I flirted with.
Well, you took out full-page ads in the New York Times to talk about your foreign policy. Some people would say...
I do feel very strongly about the country. I love the country, but I think you're going to have probably George Bush as your next president. He's an excellent guy, an excellent man. He's a friend of mine, and I'm here for that reason.
Well, I wasn't talking about this year, Mr. Trump, but you have said that if you ran for president, you'd win.
I think I'd have a very good chance. I mean, I like to win. When I do something, I like to win. I like to do well, and I think I probably would have a pretty good chance.
Tom Brokaw mentioned a moment ago that you have prospered in the Reagan years, and some people have said that Ronald Reagan ushered in an era, some people say, of greed and conspicuous consumption, and frankly, some people say Donald Trump is a conspicuous example of that. You make no apologies about the 100-room mansion in Palm Beach or the $30 million yacht.
Well, I employ thousands and thousands of people that wouldn't have jobs if it weren't for things that I built. I mean, I employ probably 25 or 30,000 people. And these are things that I've done over the last 4 or 5 year period, Chris, and I think that a lot of people are very thankful for it. So I can't make any excuses. I'm very proud of what
One last quick question. Can you laugh at the Doonesbury cartoons about the quality of the solid gold sinks in your yacht?
Well, everybody tells me I'm supposed to be honored by that. I'm not sure if it's an honor or not, but he certainly, I mean, someday maybe he's going to be able to find another topic. But I certainly seem to be in a lot of his cartoons. I'm not sure if they're good, bad, or indifferent, but I guess I'm supposed to be honored.
Donald Trump, thanks very much for coming tonight.
You have a good time.
And back to Tom Brokaw.
Gary Trudeau is a controversial figure at this convention, of course, because he portrays George Bush as the invisible man. And the other day, one of Bush's sons walked up to put his arm around him in a rather tight squeeze and looked at him with a forced smile and said, "Be kind here, be kind." One of the things that happens when you land on a national ticket like Dan Quayle did in the last 24 hours is that everything that you have done in your life is now open to very intense scrutiny. And tonight, he acknowledged that he did get some assistance in getting into the National Guard back in 1969 when he graduated from college. And that's getting a little attention down on the floor, in part from the Bush people who are eager to put all of this into the appropriate context. Two of the people who are working with, of course, the vice president are there tonight. We want to go down to Lisa Myers, who's with the media wizard of the vice president's campaign. Lisa?
Yes, Tom, I'm here with Roger Ailes, who has been called the Ernest Hemingway of campaign advisors, who was immortalized in the selling of the president, and as you said, now tends to the vice president's image. Roger, one of the things that even George Bush's friends say is that if one of his biggest problems is his public persona, fixing that is your job. Are we going to see a somewhat different George Bush tomorrow night?
Well, I don't think you can fix a 64-year-old man who's done pretty well for himself. I mean, George Bush is one of 2 men out of 250 million people in America who is going to be president. And I think he's pretty good. I think he's underrated. I think he gets up for the big game, and he's about to launch into the fall campaign. I think he'll do fine.
Big difference, though, between the private George Bush, who can be warm and witty and very relaxed, and the man who appears in public, who sometimes seems awkward and inarticulate.
Well, when somebody sticks something like this in your face and sticks a camera like that in your face and you're not used to it, you feel a little bit uncomfortable, and I don't think George was brought up with cameras. He probably never saw television till after the war, till he got back from the war and graduated from college, so he didn't grow up with this equipment, and I think that makes him nervous.
Thank you very much, Roger Ailes, who says that the one thing, though, if he could change something about George Bush, would be he wished he had a little more ego. And now let's go to Ken Bodie.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm standing with Mitch Daniels, the former White House political director. Mitch Daniels also happens to be from Dan Quayle's home state of Indiana and has known Dan Quayle for about 12 years. Mitch, as you know, we're pursuing a story about whether Dan Quayle used influence to get into the National Guard in 1968. You know Quayle. You've talked to him about this. how low a draft number was he holding at that time?
I don't have any idea. I do know that he served 6 years. He volunteered. He was subject to being called up. And like many members not only of the Guard, but of the regular Army, he wasn't called to Vietnam. But more like, unlike a majority of his generation, he did serve, and proudly so.
Mitch, you did tell me you talked to him about the draft number. Tell me about that conversation, please.
All I can tell you is that Dan recited the fact that as a college student, he wanted to serve, he applied for service, and was accepted. That's all I know, and as I say, it's a little ironic that this should come up, particularly from Democratic critics, given that their party at the time was encouraging draft resistance, flight to Canada, and opposition to the war in general.
Well, you say, Mitch, you did tell me it was a low draft number. It was low enough that it was a factor. If we do find that he turns out to be a fairly wealthy young man with an influential father who actually did use that influence to get in the National Guard in the 60s, in the late 60s, how much will that hurt you, coming as it does the very first week that America is getting to know who Dan Quayle is?
I think it'd be unfortunate if trivia like this became the first thing that America learns about someone who admittedly they are just now getting acquainted with. But I think provided that his National Guard service is fit into the context of a very proud record of public service, very courageous service, which includes the most forceful and knowledgeable advocacy of our defense needs.
Mitch, I'm sorry
I think that he'll come out fine.
Mitch Daniels, I have to throw it now to the booth and Tom Brokaw. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ken Bodie. Well, we're approaching that moment when we're going to get the nomination of George Bush here tonight, and we'll get to the roll call as well. We'll do all of that, but first we want to say we'll be back after this.
How will interest rates affect investors?
At Merrill Lynch, we believe that interest rates may rise a bit later this year, but then begin a substantial renewed decline in 1989. For investors, it means unusual opportunities. Treasury and high-quality corporate bonds could increase substantially in value. Selected groups of equities should do extremely well also. We can help with specific recommendations.
Merrill Lynch, a tradition of trust.
To write the words and make the plans that bring the future inside. To
it's on its way.
The world it can see its dreams, see them in a
From originals to copies, on screen or on paper, what you see is what we do. Team Xerox. Leadership in document processing with machines and systems that make output outstanding.
We document the world.
Even in the world's most beautiful playgrounds, things don't always go so beautifully. But that's okay as long as you have Visa Gold. Because we'll not only help you get a doctor, a lawyer for anything you need, we'll deliver a new Visa Gold and emergency cash to anywhere you are, anywhere in the world. And emergency cash is something American Express just can't deliver. Visa Gold, it's everywhere you want to be.
Well, you're in trouble already. I don't do flakes anymore. Come on, you want to make a splash with the cereal today, you got to jazz it up. Nuts, chocolate chips. Nothing here but flakes. Not something so simple. Now, I see you don't want to be full of stuff like the other guys. They zig, you zag. Very clever. I like it.
Kellogg's Corn Flakes.
Corn Flakes?
Taste them again for the first time.
Back in this convention hall where Senator Phil Gramm of Texas is about to nominate George Bush for President of the United States. And of course, this will be a memorable occasion for the Republicans. They hope it won't be quite as memorable as what happened in Atlanta when Governor Bill Clinton of Arkansas ran over at such length. Let's go down and listen to Senator Gramm.
Always seeing those terrible headlines, Graham Rudman cuts, Graham Rudman slashes, Graham Rudman denies. I'm still waiting for the headline, Graham Rudman saves taxpayers' money. And I finally figured out why that headline is never written. The people writing those headlines think that the money government spends comes from heaven. So when government doesn't spend it, it's lost. But you and I know the real story. The money government spends does not come from heaven. It comes out of the pockets of the working men and women of America. And when government does not spend our money, it's not lost. It stays with families to invest in the American dream. And my friends, that's what this election is all about. You remember what the world was like in January of 1981 when Ronald Reagan and George Bush took the oath of office. The amnesia merchants of the Atlanta Convention want us to forget that when the Democrats left the White House, inflation and interest rates were at the highest levels in American history. Prices outstripped wages, workers grew poorer, retirees saw their life savings destroyed. People couldn't build or buy their own homes or invest in their own businesses. Remember how we resented it when Jimmy Carter told us we had to learn to live on less? Of course, that turned out to be the good part. The bad part was that the tax and spend policies of the Democrats forced us to do it. The amnesia Democrats of Atlanta may have forgotten all that, but we have not forgotten, and so help us God, we are not going to allow them to do that to America again. Under the leadership of Ronald Reagan and George Bush, we've cut taxes so that working people could keep more of what they earned. We gave people incentives to work, save, and invest, and they have worked and saved and invested. With government off our backs and out of our wallets, the genius of our people reemerged. Inflation, the number one problem in the 70s, has been virtually eliminated. We have created 17 million new permanent tax-paying jobs with a future. Interest rates have plummeted, and home ownership, always part of the American dream, is again part of the American reality. But while the world calls our economic rebirth a miracle, the Democrats call it a disaster. They long for the failed policies of the past. The Chinese communists may be coming out from behind their ideological Great Wall to recognize that government is the problem and free enterprise is the answer. And perestroika may be permeating the walls of the Kremlin. But the message of economic freedom and opportunity has yet to register with the Democrats. For 4 years, Jimmy Carter and the Democrats slashed defense. Readiness and morale in the military sank. Pay lagged behind inflation, and our young servicemen and women were forced to turn to welfare and food stamps to feed their children, and the American flag drooped in shame. Our planes didn't fly and our ships didn't sail because we didn't have the spare parts or enough mechanics. And all over the world, the enemies of freedom were on the march. Under the leadership of Ronald Reagan and George Bush, all that has changed. We have built and deployed new weapons. We have recruited and retained some of the finest young men and women who've ever worn the uniform of this country, and they wear that uniform with pride all over the world tonight, and we intend to keep it that way. But the Reagan-Bush program has done more than rebuild defense, more than stop inflation, more than put America back to work, and more than rebuild our position of world leadership. It has rekindled pride and confidence in our great nation, something that many thought had been lost, perhaps forever. That's our record. What is the Michael Dukakis record? In 1974, in his first campaign for governor, Michael Dukakis promised the people of Massachusetts that he would not raise their taxes. He broke that promise the next year with the largest tax increase in the state's history. People called it Taxachusetts. He taxed the poor, taxed the rich, taxed the young, taxed the old, taxed the middle class. He taxed businesses and he taxed families. By the time the voters turned him out of office in 1979, they were carrying a tax burden 44% above the national average. Dukakis got a second chance as governor in 1983. This time he proved that he could spend as well as tax. State spending in Massachusetts grew twice as fast as federal spending. A $1 billion surplus turned into a $400 million deficit. While Ronald Reagan and George Bush worked to rebuild defense, Michael Dukakis opposed every major new weapon system that we've deployed. Given his record, is there anybody here who doubts that a President Dukakis would raise our taxes? Is there anybody here who doubts that a President Dukakis would spend our workers into poverty? Is there anybody here who doubts that a President Dukakis would cut defense, wimp America, and endanger peace? Is there anybody here who doubts that a President Dukakis would expand the power of government and its control over our businesses, our families, our churches, and our lives? No, we don't doubt it. And by the time this election's over, the American people aren't going to doubt it. And that's why there's not going to be a President Dukakis. George Bush's record of service to America spans nearly 5 decades. From naval aviator to vice president, George Bush has shown again and again his love for his country, his countrymen, and the values that made America great and strong. He has never failed to answer his nation's call to service. To each mission, he has brought integrity, determination, and the skill to get the job done. George left home and joined the Navy the week he graduated from high school on his 18th birthday. When he got his wings at the Corpus Christi Naval Air Station, George Bush was the youngest pilot in the Navy. In the South Pacific, he flew 58 combat missions. In those missions, as in everything else he's done in his life, George Bush showed that quiet courage that Texans and Americans have always looked to in a time of crisis and danger. When he took off during an attack on the fleet and his engine failed, George Bush didn't panic. He didn't break radio silence. He ditched the plane and led his crew to safety. On a bombing run at Chichijima, his plane was hit. Both his crewmen were killed. As flames swept over the wings and cockpit, George Bush remembered the first obligation of a leader is to accomplish the mission. He stayed on his bombing run and dropped 2 tons of TNT right on the target. He turned his crippled plane out to sea and bailed out. The Japanese sent boats to capture him, but his fellow pilots hovered over him, strafing the Japanese to keep them back. With blood streaming down his face, with a .38 revolver in one hand, he paddled away from shore with the other to be rescued by a submarine. Let me read from his citation for the Distinguished Flying Cross. By his superb airmanship, courageous actions, and loyal dedication to duty, Lieutenant Bush reflected great credit upon himself and upheld the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. Signed, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. My friends, when Michael Dukakis vetoed that bill providing for the Pledge of Allegiance to the American flag in Massachusetts public schools, he did not represent the views of George Bush. We will never have to worry about George Bush's willingness to stand up for America. He knows from real life experience that peace comes through strength, not through wishful thinking. The commitment of George Bush and Ronald Reagan to a strong national defense has brought peace. It has brought the Soviets to the bargaining table and produced the unprecedented elimination of a whole class of nuclear weapons. Under George Bush's leadership, we can keep America strong and at peace. We can let the real competition begin, a competition of vision and ideas. Building on the bedrock achievements of the Reagan-Bush years, we can move beyond simply maintaining the little freedom which exists on this earth. The defense of freedom today begins in Nicaragua and Afghanistan, but the competition of vision and ideas can never end until all the world is free, including the people of Central America and Cuba and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union itself. George Bush, warrior when his country needed warriors, came home from the war and married the girl whose name was painted on the side of his plane, Barbara. He came home to continue his education and to put the American free enterprise system to work for him and for his family. George took his family and moved to Midland, Texas, and started in the oil business. He learned the business working for others and went into business for himself. He met the payroll, paid the bills, pioneered new technology used today around the world. In time, George Bush turned again to public service, being elected as Houston's first Republican congressman since Reconstruction. In the House of Representatives, he fought against excessive government spending and for civil rights. He later served as ambassador to the United Nations, and when history was made with the opening of relations with Communist China, George Bush was sent to Peking to represent our nation. He came home to head the Central Intelligence Agency, where he strengthened the intelligence community while working to guarantee the rights of our citizens. Through it all, George Bush found time to be a devoted husband and a loving father to 5 children and grandfather to 10. George Bush is the greatest vice president this nation has ever had. He has always made us proud. When the Soviet Union targeted a new class of nuclear weapons at Western Europe, destroying the military balance and threatening peace, Vice President Bush flew to Europe to meet with our NATO allies. Prime Minister Thatcher of Britain, President Mitterrand of France, Chancellor Kohl of West Germany, and the others. They know George Bush. They trust him. They respect him. And from those meetings came their decision they would deploy missiles in Europe. The threat was answered, the alliance held, and Moscow understood. And as a result, today we have an INF treaty, and the Soviet missiles are being withdrawn and destroyed. Now, that's what leadership is about. As chairman of the South Florida Task Force, George Bush put together this nation's first really successful effort to protect our children from illegal drugs. While Michael Dukakis opposes mandatory sentencing for the thugs who sell drugs to our children and opposes the death penalty for drug pushers who murder our police officers, George Bush knows that the only way you can deal with drug pushers is to grab them by the throat. George Bush is our president, that's exactly what we're going to do. Under his leadership, we can and will rid America of illegal drugs. America is not a great nation because brilliant and talented people came to live here. America is a great nation because our system offers incentives and opportunities for greatness. America has produced extraordinary results from plain, ordinary, common people like you and me. The genius of America's success lies not in the brilliance of a few, but in the spirit of enterprise, work, and family of all of us who call ourselves Americans. Our program has rekindled that spirit to bring greater prosperity to more people than ever before. But we have only scratched the surface of what America can be. With George Bush as our president, with Dan Quayle as our vice president, building on the success of the last 8 years, there is no limit to the future of the American people. I am honored to place in nomination the name of a man who has served America in war and in peace, who has the experience, the character, and the strength to lead this great land we love. Mr. Chairman, I nominate for President of the United States, George Bush of Houston, Texas.
Senator Phil Gramm of Texas nominating Vice President George Bush, and as he tagged it with his address of Houston, Texas, President of the United States, the nominee of the Republican Party. Texas, a mighty important battleground state come the fall with its 29 electoral votes and with a native son on the other ticket, Lloyd Bentsen, the other senator from Texas who once defeated George Bush for the U.S. Senate. Now, the Republicans have a little script in mind. This demonstration will go on for about 5 minutes, and then we'll see some balloons. Not much has happened here that you could describe as being something unexpected. The one tiny blip, I suppose you would describe it on the radar screen tonight, John, would be this business about did Dan Quayle use the privilege of his family to get into the National Guard? Of course, people are confident that they can handle that, and they're now beginning to blame the Democrats for spinning out that story. But in fact, we've seen no evidence of that whatsoever. It's the kind of natural question that you would ask for someone of that age, at that time, who now is on the Armed Services Committee and has a very strong pro-military point of view about why he went to the National Guard instead of enlisting.
Tom, I think you have to put it into context. When somebody in 1969 was graduated from college and didn't go to Vietnam and has become a hardliner on defense later, the question is inevitable: why weren't you in Vietnam? The press didn't bring this up really, except that it was on his record. He answered it in not a complete way today, and he answered it not quite in a complete way tonight. The Democrats will be back on it, and so will the press, and I hope it's resolved soon. But it's an inevitability. That's the context.
And the Bush people have been down there on the floor dealing with it. George Bush Jr. talked about it. Craig Fuller talked about it. Mitch Daniels was a political operative in Indiana for the Republicans and also talked about it tonight. We'll just wait and see whether this goes any more than it has so far. But that's what we learned here this evening, that Dan Quayle belonged to the National Guard at that time.
Tom, believe me, and you know this, when the Bush people went over his record and saw that, they knew full well that the press and the public and the Democrats would raise these questions about what were you doing at that time.
Moving on to other issues that'll make the gladden the hearts more of the Bush people. We want to get to those balloons. There are about 200,000 of them. And there they begin to fall, a few at a time. 200,000 balloons, all of them blown up by hand. A young man from California by the name of Bill Chappelle supervised that operation, and they worked days and days on end with a machine and volunteers. We may not get them all tonight. You've got to save some tomorrow night for the nominee himself when he makes his acceptance speech. night for the balloon manufacturers of America, a great night for the Republican delegates to this convention, and a memorable, historic night for Vice President George Bush. His name has been placed in nomination. We'll be back with more, including the roll call of the states, right after this.
Tradition of trust, and by GE, From plastics to financial services, we bring good things to life. And by Ford and your Ford dealer. Have you driven a Ford lately? And by All Brand, the natural high-fiber cereal from Kellogg's.
Sometimes I don't know what to believe. What food's good for you, what's not. But I guess I can believe reports from the National Cancer Institute. They say some studies suggest a high-fiber, low-fat diet may reduce the risk of some kinds of cancer. So I made some changes, like eating Kellogg's All Brand. Just 1 tablespoon of All Brand has more fiber than a whole serving of most other cereals. Am I going to change what I eat for breakfast? You better believe it.
High-fiber Kellogg's All Brand.
One of Road and Track's 10 best values in the world. One of Car and Driver's 10 best cars. And the world's best-selling car. Along with all their acclaim, these cars share the nameplate of America's most successful car company, Ford.
Winning the world over. Have you been behind the wheel? Winning the world over. Have you driven a Ford lately?
All our science, our technology, our mathematics. Somehow they add up to moments beyond any calculation.
Wouldn't it be nice to be going home for a change? We asked for it. Why do you think Mr. Merrill's pushing this new training program?
Welcome back, soldier. Well, the war's over. The country's gonna grow. And we gotta have the best trained people to help folks take advantage of it.
Right.
Charlie Merrill said find the brightest people and train them well.
Don't you two ever go home?
It's a lesson Merrill Lynch has never forgotten. Merrill Lynch. A tradition of trust.
We're back at the Superdome in New Orleans, which is a football field, but tonight it's a kind of giant stadium, a pep rally, if you will, for Vice President George Bush, the old captain of the Yale baseball team, who's about to become the nominee for President of the United States of this Republican Party. We still have the roll call to go. At the podium now with NBC's Connie Chung is a man who placed his name in nomination. He's Senator Phil Gramm of Texas, and he's the other half of Gramm Rudman. Connie?
Thank you, Tom. Senator, I saw you over there as the balloons came down. You were throwing them overboard, having a lot of fun.
I was having a lot of fun, Connie. It was a great opportunity. I appreciate getting the chance to do it. George Bush deserves to be president, and I wanted to let people know what his record was, a record over 5 decades.
Now, you didn't have any problems tonight, not the kind that Bill Clinton had.
Well, Governor Clinton called me, and he had lots of advice, and one of the pieces of advice was, take all the time you need. And my mama told me to stand up straight, not to cuss.
Well, you minded your mom, didn't you?
I did.
How does this demonstration compare to past convention demonstrations? As you look around,
well, there are a lot of balloons. If they're going to have more than this with George Bush tomorrow, they're going to create great prosperity in the balloon industry.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Phil Gramm. Back to Tom Brokaw.
Thank you. Texas, of course, will be a battleground state with its 29 electoral votes, and it's an important state this year, especially because the Texas economy has been on its ear as a result of what's been going on principally in the energy field, oil and gas. And the Texas senator, or rather the governor of Texas now, Bill Clement, has been in some political difficulty, according to the polls recently, because the state's economy is just in a lot of trouble. Lloyd Benson's on the ticket for the Democrats. We'll be hearing a lot about Texas come the fall. We'll also be hearing a lot about this man. His name is Bob Teeter. He's the pollster and one of the major strategists for this campaign of Vice President George Bush. And NBC's Andrea Mitchell is standing by now with Bob Teeter. Andrea?
Thank you, Tom. I'm with, as you say, Bob Teeter, who has been working on the strategy, the politics of inclusion that we've been talking about with the Bush campaign, and who also, of course, knows Dan Quayle better than almost anyone. You were one of the advisors suggesting Quayle. You've worked with Quayle for years. Tell me this. How, if George Bush needs to reach out to women,
How does this close the gender gap? Isn't it a little bit demeaning to think that you can close the gender gap just by putting a very good-looking man on the ticket?
Yeah, I think that would be very demeaning to women, Andrea. And certainly I don't think the vice president had any intention of doing that. I think he picked Dan Quayle because he thought he was the best person to run with him on the ticket, not only to win the election, but to serve the country.
What about the other issue that affects a lot of women, the question of abortion? Dan Quayle has a very hard line against any freedom of choice. Is that going to help appeal to the women that you need to close that gender gap?
Well, Andrea, there are a lot of women who have a fairly strong right-to-life position in this country. Obviously, that's an issue that divides almost every group in this country, whether they're liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat. But there are a lot of women of the younger generation, older generation, who simply agree with the right-to-life position, and I think they'll be very happy with him. They have been in Indiana. And certainly, the Quayle choice by the vice president, I don't think, is in any way directed at women or simply to close the gender gap. It was a national choice and one that he thought would help the ticket the most.
Is it the generational politics? Is that what you were really aiming at?
Well, I think there's some aspect to that, and it wasn't a question of whether we were aiming at it. It's a question of what the vice president decided. And I think what the vice president was thinking about is that he wanted someone who was seen as a rising star in the country, and as someone who's a rising star in the Senate and the Republican Party, someone who was seen as a leader of the future, and someone who might have a unique ability to communicate with a group of voters, a large group of under 40-year-old voters who really have never had anyone on a national ticket yet.
We have to ask you, with all of this commotion going on behind us, what it feels like to have been one of George Bush's closest advisors and friends over these years to finally have this nomination in play.
Well, it feels terrific because I'm one of those people that started with him in 1979 when he ran in 79 and 80. And certainly this is the culmination not only of that period, but of 3 years of hard work this time. And I think getting the nomination early and getting it with a unified party like this really launches us on our way to a successful campaign this fall.
Okay, thanks very much to Bob Teeter, who is, of course, going to have a lot to say about the strategy from here on in. Tom?
Thank you very much, Andrea Mitchell and Bob Teeter. He's one of those familiar faces behind the scenes, familiar to us, maybe not to you, but he's one of the most important men in Republican Party politics, and he has been for a long time now. This demonstration is still going on for the nomination of George Bush. We still have the roll call to go, but there is kind of general pandemonium down there. This is a night for release for these delegates who've worked long and hard to get here on behalf of George Bush. So let's go to the floor now, and Lisa Myers. Lisa?
Thanks, Tom. I'm here with Nancy Bush Ellis, and it's hard to think of anyone other than Barbara Bush who has worked harder to get George Bush to this point. Mrs. Ellis, did you ever think you'd get this far? Did you ever think you'd get this far?
Yes, I did. I knew we'd get this far. I knew it once when he started in 79, and here we are in 88, and I'm not surprised, but I'm thrilled.
You were at a private dinner this evening with your brother in the French Quarter. What did he say to all of you?
He thanked us. He thanked us for all our work for him. And we all got up and gave toast and thanked him for making our lives so thrilling.
You may be moving to Ohio, I understand, in October to handle your brother's campaign there?
Wherever they want me, I'll be glad to go. I'd like to go to Illinois. These guys are right next door.
One of the things that you've talked about were all the misperceptions about your brother. What bothers you most?
There are no misperceptions anymore. The country's just going to see him for the great human being he is and elect him in the poll.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And now let's go to Chris Alvin. Chris Wallace.
George.
Thanks, Lisa. Despite all of the jollity here on the floor of this convention, the Republicans are going to have a problem this fall, and that is the ethics issue, the so-called sleaze factor in the Republican administration. Lynn Nofziger used to be the political director for the Reagan White House. Now he's appealing a 90-day sentence for illegal lobbying. Mr. Nofziger, set your personal case aside and talk as a political strategist. Isn't the ethics issue, the sleaze factor, a pretty good issue for the Democrats this year?
No, I don't think it is, and I'll tell you why. Because the party of Teddy Kennedy shouldn't make sleaze an issue. The party of a candidate who turns criminals loose to go prey on innocent people shouldn't make sleaze an issue. The party of a vice presidential candidate who seeks to charge $10,000 to have lobbyists meet with him shouldn't make sleaze an issue.
So what are you saying? It's okay if you guys have done some things wrong because they did too?
Yeah, I didn't say that. You know it. What I did say is that it is not a party issue. Sleaze is something that crosses party lines, and for every Republican you can find and point a finger at, you can find a Democrat.
What did you think when Michael Dukakis made that remark about a fish starts rotting from the head?
Well, I looked at his own head, because he's a guy who's got at least one guy in jail up there, so on illegal stuff. So I think he better look to his home.
How do you explain the fact that so many people in this administration have gotten into trouble, and some of the president's closest friends, men like Mike Deaver and Lynn Nofziger?
But not when they were in this administration. Nobody can point a finger at what Mike Deaver did or Lynn Nofziger did while they were in the administration. But you can point a finger at the guy up there in Massachusetts who was in the administration when he was violating the law.
Mr. Nofziger, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Lynn Nofziger, bloodied but unbowed about the ethics wars in this political campaign. Now to Ken Bodie.
Thank you, Chris. I'm standing here at the bandstand with Thad Garrett, the former domestic policy advisor to Vice President Bush during his first administrative term, and now the domestic policy advisor to the Bush campaign. Thad, what do you think of the platform that the Republican Party has given you here as you try to outreach this party to blacks, or reach this party out to black voters?
Well, I think a number of black Republicans had hoped that the platform would perhaps go further to emphasize party support for such issues of affirmative action, for taking a strong stand against apartheid in South Africa, for reaching out and broadening the base. We realize that the political process is such as a give and take, and we will support this party and this platform, and we're going to actively support this candidate, George Bush.
Thad, does it make it any easier that Senator Gordon Humphrey is crowing about a victory on the floor for you when you try to sell this ticket, this platform?
Well, I believe that people will vote for the presidential candidate as well as the vice presidential candidate, but George Bush is our candidate for president, and he has a good record on civil rights.
But last night, the first decision that he made to put a man on the ticket, he put a senator on the ticket who doesn't have a great civil rights record, who voted against the civil rights bill and voted to sustain the veto on the civil rights bill.
Well, I personally supported the civil rights bill, and I know George Bush, had he been president, certainly would have led it in a different direction. But we're going to support the ticket. We're going to support George Bush strongly. He personally has a great civil rights record.
Tom, Thad Garrett is not at his first convention. In fact, he's not at his only party convention. The first time I met Thad Garrett was in the 1972 convention, the McGovern convention in Miami, a Democratic convention, and Mr. Thad Garrett then was an advisor to Congresswoman Shirley.
But a Republican, always.
And back to you, Tom Brokaw in the booth.
Well, that's traveling through a lot of different currents in American political life. We don't want to miss the roll call, of course, so we'll be back right after this.
Why is Merrill Lynch strongly recommending bonds?
Our research group believes that long-term interest rates are close to their peak, and the yield on 30-year Treasury bonds will decline during 1989 to under 7%. This means that bonds offer handsome current yields, plus the potential for substantial capital gains if interest rates fall. We suggest investors begin accumulating bonds now.
Merrill Lynch, a tradition of trust.
Is it June yet?
Miss Sunshine.
Don't start, Hackett.
Okay. Breakfast?
Brought mine?
It's like dessert.
What's that, an experiment?
Nutri-Grain nuggets?
It's too loud.
Come on.
Kellogg's Nutri-Grain Nuggets, the first whole grain nugget cereal.
Crunchy, huh? Oh, I saw a smile.
Nutri-Grain Nuggets.
Dedicated to the ones we love.
Traffic 2 over.
The Ford Tempo GLS. A sophisticated sports sedan with true feel-of-the-road handling. Ford Tempo GLS. A sleek example of design leadership. It's a more sophisticated way to express your driving ambition.
Now get a $400 cash bonus on Ford Tempo.
We go hand in hand, you and me. We are threads in the invisible tapestry.
People helping people. At GE, it's part of everything we do, so that every product and service we provide is the best it can be to help you reach your dreams.
GE, glad we can help. We bring, we're always there
A lot has changed in American politics over the years, of course. No longer are there real smoke-filled rooms. First of all, most rooms now have no smoking signs within them. This process is pretty well wrapped up by the time that people get to the convention as a result of the primaries and the caucuses, and the parties are attempting quite candidly to use this as a kind of a 4-day television commercial for their chances in the fall. And things have changed from our side as well. Earlier tonight, in a look back, a historic flashback, if you will, at television, we showed you just briefly Tom Dewey as the winner of the nomination as we portrayed that in 1948. If we could just show that to you again, we'll show you what the graphics were like in those days.
1,094 votes, a clean sweep. We have other ways of expressing visually just what has happened a few moments ago, in fact 8 minutes ago, with the fall of the gavel at the end of the third ballot. It's a victory, say the numbers, and every one of the leading candidates, other than Governor Dewey, has agreed. Vandenberg, MacArthur, Stassen, Warren, Baldwin, and Taft, we all say that it's a win for Governor Dewey. Dewey wins. Clearly, simply, completely, and wholly, it's Tom Dewey of New York, Governor of New York, the nominee for President of the United States of the Republican Party here in Philadelphia.
John Chancellor, you weren't there for that particular one, I don't think, were you?
No, I wasn't there for that one. We did it better in my day, which started in 1952.
Well, I remember seeing, in fact, on election night, you standing over and Chet Huntley once describing you as looking like a small boy down on Wall Street with a tote board, posting the prices for that.
Well, we'd use blackboards at one point. I always think we ought to go back to blackboards because they were exciting and they made it more of a contest, and the evening lasted all night, and it was very good. We once used cash registers, masked, so that you could just see the numbers. It was more fun in those days, I think, Tom.
For everyone, but it couldn't be any more fun tonight than it is for George Bush, of course, who his name is being seconded now by some distinguished members of his family. We've just heard from Helen Hayes here in the convention hall. We want to go back down to the podium now and hear some more about George Bush tonight, because after all, this is the night that belongs to him.
From the middle Atlantic region of our great nation, the chair calls on the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, home of that teacher of character and coach of champions, an individual noted for his commitment to excellence, Joe Paterno.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the fourth time I've been in this dome. The last two visits, Penn State was playing for the national championship. In 1982, we were fortunate to beat a great Georgia team. And in 1978, right over there in that end zone underneath the NBC newsstand, a great goal line stand by Bear Bryant's Alabama team beat us. And Bear, if you're watching, I hope I don't blow this one. I know a lot of people are wondering why an Italian-American football coach from Penn State is doing here. So am I. However, I hope that after 40 years of trying to help young men and women reach their potential as human beings, I'm here as an educator. Obviously, I'm here because George Bush invited me. And on behalf of my family and myself and the state of Pennsylvania, I want to thank him for this great honor. I'm here because I'm for someone, and I'm not here because I'm against anyone. I'm here because I believe George Bush will be one of America's great presidents. I'm here because I believe in quality education at all levels. And I'm convinced that George Bush will be an education president. I'm here because I've been back to the section of Brooklyn where my immigrant grandparents and my mother grew up. I've been to the inner cities of this country to recruit athletes for Penn State. And this country cannot continue to let these people live without hope. hope to dream the dreams my family dreams. And I know George wants a better life for all Americans, especially the ones we have left behind. I'm here because, like President Ford, I'll be damned if I'll sit still while people who can't carry George Bush's shoes ridicule them. After a lifetime of being around great competitors, I know a winner, and I know a leader. I know the difference between bravado and the quiet, dignified confidence of a Joe DiMaggio, a Walter Payton, a George Bush. George Bush will be a great president, and I humbly second his nomination. Thank you.
Well, I don't know what you think, but I think that that's the political equivalent of a 100-yard return or a kickoff for a touchdown. That can't hurt the Vice President of the United States to have Joe Paterno, who is one of the most popular figures in American sport.
From our far western shores, the chair turns to the state of California.
And the Chancellor and I had been here that day in the booth. I'm not sure that the Crimson Tide could have scored against Pennsylvania.
They would have knocked the booth down.
Elaine Chao.
Lisa Myers on the floor.
Thanks, Tom. I'm here with Dorothy Bush LeBlanc, the Vice President's daughter, who used to get so upset about what people said about her dad she wouldn't campaign, but she's become a real trooper now. What are you feeling tonight?
I am so thrilled to be here, and I'm so excited to be able to cast the votes for my state and have my brothers do the same, and it's just a really thrilling night for my family.
What did you say to your dad at dinner tonight?
Well, we had a very teary dinner with all my family. My dad said to us, thanked us for all we'd done, and several of my brothers got up and really told him how much we loved him and my mom, and it was a really nice send-off to this nomination night. So
you're very close to your father. What did you say to him?
I just, you know, we're so close that I can't, it's very difficult for me to, you know, it's too emotional to really say what I really feel. I gave him a big hug and told him I loved him and said, watch me on TV, Dad, because I'm going to, you know, you'll see how much I love you tonight. And so that's what I told him.
What do you hope happens tomorrow? What will you be doing tomorrow?
Well, what will I be doing? I think I have a caucus team meeting and a few delegation meetings and that kind of thing. And then I'll be here with my little family, my children, listening to my father's speech.
It's also Doro's 29th birthday tomorrow.
That's right.
And now let's go to Chris Wallace.
Thanks, Lisa. We're here in the New Hampshire delegation with the governor of New Hampshire and one of George Bush's co-chairmen, Governor John Sununu. Lisa Myers was just talking to the governor's, the vice president's daughter, Dorothy, who was very emotional. I would think even for a hardened politician like you, this is a pretty exciting evening.
Well, it is exciting. You work hard. Obviously, it's a foregone conclusion tonight, but it's still nice to come to a point where folks can get together and share it emotionally.
But, you know, it wasn't a foregone conclusion when he was up in New Hampshire, having finished third in Iowa, and you were the key man. You were the man he was depending on to win that New Hampshire primary and get him back in the game. At that point, how unlikely and how far away did New Orleans seem?
Well, I think we had confidence. We were always ready to correct any mistake Iowa might have made, and I think we demonstrated that New Hampshire picks presidents.
We know that George Bush is very grateful to you. Do you think there might be a job for John Sununu in a Bush administration?
Oh, I'll probably go back to the real world to a real job.
You don't think working in Washington is the real world and a real job?
Better leave that question unanswered right now.
How tough a campaign do you think it's going to be? I mean, there's a great elation tonight, but it's a long way from November.
It is. It's going to be a tough campaign, but I think that with a candidate and the nominee of president, that is George Bush as the nominee, with the vice presidential nomination going to Quayle, and a strong platform, I think we have a mainstream candidacy that will do well in this election, and I think it's not going to, as we get to the end, not going to be as tough as people think.
Governor, thanks very much. Governor John Sununu, who was there when George Bush needed him and is enjoying the fruits of victory tonight in New Orleans. Now to Ken Bodie.
Thank you, Chris. I'm standing out here on the floor of the convention with a familiar face. If you look at that face and you wonder who it is, remind you it's Kevin Sweeney, Gary Hart's press secretary, who's now crossed the line, and you're doing what?
I'm now a character cop. I'm a journalist. I've joined you folks.
You're a character cop?
Sure.
Oh, I see. And what are you doing at this convention?
I'm here. I'm actually covering for a TV station in Atlanta, WAGA. I'm here as a reporter, as an analyst for them.
What's your impression of the Republicans? You've been a Democratic press operative. What's your impression of this convention?
I'm trying to cover it as a reporter, so I'm looking at how they're doing the convention. I think they've had a real tough time getting their message out, simply because we've heard all about Dan Quayle. It's not really George Bush's show just yet, so that's what they're trying to do here tonight.
And what are the themes that these guys do better, as you were telling me, than the Democrats
These folks do patriotism better than anybody. They do it a lot better than Democrats.
They do patriotism?
Well, it's a tactic. I mean, George Orwell wrote about 40 years ago that it's impossible to understand the modern world as it is without understanding nationalism and patriotism and national loyalty. And these folks know that. It's a powerful tool, both in politics and also to get the country moving in a positive way. And so they do a pretty good job at that. It is a tool.
It is a tool.
Sure.
Kevin Sweeney, former Gary Hart press secretary, now crossed the line, one of us, a journalist, turncoat, and now to Andrea Mitchell.
Thank you, Ken. I'm here just off the floor with a couple of prominent Republicans. We have the former senator and former Republican national chairman, Bill Brock, and of course, Senator McCain, who from Arizona. First to you, Senator Brock, what's your analysis of the ticket? You ran previous campaigns for the party. How is Bush Quayle going to do?
I'm excited about it. Dan Quayle brings such a freshness. I know him so well because when I was Secretary of Labor, he carried the president's program to bring new training programs to young people, to give them a chance to get a job. He is a very creative, hardworking, family guy, and I just think he's a spectacular human being. It's going to be a strong ticket. I think we're going to win.
Now, you say that from the perspective of also having run Bob Dole's presidential campaign and being very close to Bob Dole. A lot of people say that someone like Dole would have been a lot stronger, more substantial than Dan Quayle.
Well, I think what George Bush did was to look to the future, to take someone that has a growth capacity, and Dan Quayle has that. He has shown tremendous growth. In the very few years he's been in Washington, he's become a leader and a very exciting person, and that's going to make a difference in November.
Okay, now one thing that might make a difference, it's a little too early to tell, is this issue of his war record, the fact that he chose the National Guard, Senator, rather than choosing military service in the Marines as his brother did. And there's a question tonight, at least, as to whether or not he used a little influence to get into the National Guard. As a former prisoner of war, what do you think of that?
Well, first of all, Andrea, I have no knowledge of any influence, and I would be astonished if there was any. But I believe that service in the Guard is indeed our patriotic and honorable service. In case of war or emergency, the Guard is an integral part of our defense. They deploy immediately. And I think it would be a disservice to the hundreds of thousands of men and women in the Guard to somehow denigrate service in our National Guard.
And do you think that there is a political downside to this if it turns out that he, in fact, did use some influence? He came from a wealthy family and tried to avoid going to Vietnam.
I think if there is an allegation that's proven, and frankly, I don't believe that it's the case, and I would be astonished if it were, then there could be a problem. But knowing Dan Quayle, he's an honorable and decent person. I don't think that's the case.
Okay, thank you very much, Senator McCain. Thanks to you, former Senator Bill Brock. And now back to Tom Brokaw.
Thanks, Andrew. I remember Bill Brock vividly in the state of New Hampshire. He was running the Dole campaign there, and they thought that they were going to win in New Hampshire. They'd won just the week before in Iowa. But in kind of a political metaphor that may be fitting, they ran into an 18-wheeler in George Bush's campaign. He went out there and drove an 18-wheeler and put himself around that state, showed that he had a human side to him as well, not just a vice presidential figure. And, of course, he won New Hampshire. The Dole campaign was over. Tonight, Vice President George Bush will be the nominee of this party. And then come the fall. We'll hear this roll call tonight, and as those states are ticked off, you may want to think in your mind about a big political map, because these states are not separate but equal. These states have electors, the Electoral College. I think a lot of people are still confused about the Electoral College, and with good reason. You know, what happens in a presidential race is that the electors are based on the percentage of the population that those states have from the nation. And what has been happening is that there's been a shift. The powerful Electoral College states are places like Florida, Texas, California now, where Ronald Reagan ran very strongly. And if this man, George Bush, wants to win, he has to do well in those big states.
Well, Tom, as you know, the phrase, the Republicans' electoral lock, on great parts of the country has been part of our political vocabulary for some years, but now in 1988, people are believing that the Republican lock has been lost, and that this is going to be a much closer contest in terms of both parties, in terms of electoral votes. And most political scientists now believe that the Democrats have a chance of breaking that for the first time. And we'll see during the roll call tonight. It's too bad that NBC can't super the weight of these states. Well, Indiana with 12, Texas with 29. That's really the arithmetic of getting elected president in the United States.
Well, we'll talk about that. You've been watching these seconding speeches down here.
They have done something here I've never seen before. They have had 6 seconding speeches from the floor of the convention. When you saw Joe Paterno, the football coach from Pennsylvania, he was on the floor. We've never seen that happen before. Normally, the seconding speeches take all night. They are all done from the podium. Tonight, they are very brief, and they're being done down on the floor, and I hand the Republicans the medal for innovation in changing political conventions. All of that will be over in a minute, Tom, because these are very short 2-minute speeches, but they reflect the diversity of the delegates and the support for Bush, and they're all from the floor.
Well, we'll be back with some of those seconding speeches, and we'll be back with a roll call as well. Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas, after this.
I just proposed additional IBM PS2s.
Oh, good.
You want to know why?
Do I want to know why?
Come on, ask me why.
Why?
Compatibility.
I love compatibility.
PS2s can run the programs we run on these old PCs, which means we can keep using the software we've already got. Are you following all
I'm
that?
hanging on every word.
Not to mention the PS2's increased speed and superior graphics.
Not to mention advanced OS2 capabilities.
Were you listening outside the door? Was he listening outside the door?
Next up, Milwaukee, end of the line.
No, sir. It's just spaghetti. I'm here to open our new branch office. Soon we'll be all over America. Mr. Merrill, that's my boss, says people don't just invest in companies. They invest in dreams.
That's so.
There's no dream too big for a country this size.
Charlie Merrill's vision brought Wall Street to Main Street. Today, that vision helps Merrill Lynch find financial opportunities around the world. Merrill Lynch, a tradition of trust.
Even in the world's most beautiful playgrounds, things don't always go so beautifully. But that's okay as long as you have Visa Gold. Because we'll not only help you get a doctor, a lawyer for anything you need, we'll deliver a new Visa Gold and emergency cash to anywhere you are, anywhere in the world. And emergency cash is something American Express just can't deliver. Visa Gold, it's everywhere you want to be.
You're looking at a picture of Vice President George Bush, who is about to become the nominee of this party. Right now, however, his official title is grandfather. He is surrounded by grandchildren at a hotel suite in downtown New Orleans. He said last week that he feels that he's kept his family from the American people too much, that they want to know about his role in this large, gregarious, and a family of great achievers. And so he said, you'll be seeing a lot of the Bushes, and we certainly have been doing that here in New Orleans this week. They're getting ready, of course, for that traditional shot of when he goes over the top, and he'll do that when the roll call reaches Texas, where his son, George Bush Jr., lives. When they go over the top, we'll be seeing more pictures from that hotel room tonight of the Vice President of the United States, about to become the Republican nominee, grandfather George Bush. Now let's go to the podium.
Please, for our future, for our posterity, put another great, courageous team back in the White House. What did our heroic president say about our George on Monday night? Gutsy, true grit, cool under fire. Right on, Mr. President. Sure, we're going to win another one for the Gipper, but we're also going to win it for ourselves and our children and for people who live for freedom all around the world. My friends, especially Reagan Democrats, especially you Irish Catholics out there who are still registered Democrats, please, the stakes have never been higher for faith, for family, or for country. Stand up for America. God bless the USA!
Bob Dornan, the very conservative, flamboyant, and outspoken congressman from Orange County, California, former television commentator and an Air Force veteran. Very conservative indeed, and he's been with George Bush throughout this long campaign. Now let's go to the podium, and Connie Chung can explain some of the procedure that is coming later tonight. Connie, they're going on and on with this. What are the chances that they're going to get it wrapped up on time?
Very doubtful, Tom. As usual, conventions do go on longer than they should, or as planned. Tonight's roll call will actually be very much so a family affair. The 5 Bush children are all representing different states. George from Texas, and Neil from Colorado, Jeb from Florida, Marvin from Virginia, and Dorothy from Maine. Each of them will be called, and they will say that their delegation votes for George Bush. Texas, of course, as we all know, will be putting George Bush over the top with his son George Bush Jr. But by the end of the roll call, all the children will go to Maine, which of course is another state that George Bush considers his home, as they do go to Kennebunkport every summer. And those 5 children will then ask that their nomination be acclaimed by acclamation. Tom, back to you.
Thanks, Connie. We're going to go back down to the floor. More seconding speeches. Bush family members in this case, Colombo and Jeb Bush. They live in the state of Florida. She is Mexican-born. He met her there during a trip, and they have grandchildren who are assembled with the Vice President tonight and also are in this floor in the Vice Presidential box.
George Bush. With hope and with love, I second the nomination for the President of the United States, someone who has been like my father to me, an honest, intelligent, and capable man, my father-in-law, George Bush.
The Vice President became very emotional today when he was asked about his reference yesterday to his grandchildren from the Jeb and Colombo Bush family as the little brown ones, referring to their complexion as he was singling them out for the President of the United States because he cares about them so deeply. And he said, do not include them in this process. Well, there's looks like about a 3-year-old grandchild doing his children work.
All states will be called. If any state desires to pass, they may do so, of course. At the conclusion of the first call by the Secretary will proceed to call the names of those states which passed on the first call. No delegation will be recognized to change its vote until all delegations which
Bob
pass
Michael,
have
the
been given
Republican
a
leader in
second
the
opportunity
House
to
and
vote.
one of George Bush's oldest friends,
To be required by Rule
a real
13C.
bulwark of the Republican Party, and he's
Now, if the
explaining
delegates
that
will please take
if you
their
want to pass, you may do so. This
And
has all
again,
been
we must
carefully
have
worked out
the
in
aisles
advance
in
with the
reasonable order.
various party chairmen
The
of the
sergeant at
delegations, the chairman of the
please do your
delegation, so that they
job
can
out there,
get
clear
the
the
appropriate
aisles of
people
all
in place,
persons,
and so
whether
that
delegates
Texas
or the media,
can give him, that is the Vice President, the number of delegates that he needs to go over the top. And speaking for Texas tonight will be George Bush Jr., the 42-year-old son of the Vice
selection of the
President.
nominee for President of the United States as required by Rule 16 of our convention rules. In balloting, the vote of each state shall be announced by the chairman of each respective delegation. The chair will ask the secretary of the convention, Mrs. Pat Psyche, to announce the number of votes to which each state is entitled. The assistant secretary, Lynn Gunderson Martin, will repeat the name of the delegation, and she will acknowledge the votes as they are received. The secretary will commence calling the roll.
Thank you. Aloha. As a fellow Republican from the beautiful 50th state of Hawaii, a state in the forefront of the coming Pacific era, I feel privileged tonight to serve as a secretary of the Republican National Convention. I am honored at this time to begin the official roll call of the states to name George Bush the next president of the United States. Here we go, delegates. Here we come, America. The first state, Alabama, with 38 votes.
Madam Secretary, the great state of Alabama is tremendously proud of Guy Hunt, our first Republican governor in over 100 years.
Alabama has 9 electoral votes. It's gone Republican in the last 2 elections.
Alabama is a state of surprises. From the white sandy beaches of Mobile, to the Shakespeare Festival in Montgomery, to the world-famous medical center in Birmingham, to the space program in Huntsville. Alabama is very proud to cast all 38 votes for the next president of the United States, George Herbert Walker Bush.
Alabama has cast 38 votes for the next great president of the United States, George Bush.
Alaska, 19 votes.
And 3 electoral votes in Alaska.
Madam Secretary, Jerry Prevost Chairman, the great state of Alaska, with its enormous storehouse of energy resources, stands ready to be the vital state in preserving our energy independence, especially from foreign oil. Alaska, with over 70% of our nation's parks, is our nation's wildlife and parks playground. Alaska is committed to preserving this playground while its energy resources are developed for the rest of our great nation. Alaska, with its enormous supply of natural resources like fish and timber, is a key state in supplying these products and thereby helping to reduce the trade deficit. Alaska, with its strategic location to Russia, continues to be a vital state in preserving our national security by being a front line of defense. We especially welcome the addition of home porting being considered by our Navy. Alaska, once thought of as Seward's folly, is now thought of as security for the future of America. Our slogan tonight as a delegation, America needs it, Alaska's got it, means we are ready to share it. Tonight, the Alaskan Republican delegation, along with its 2 distinguished Republican senators, Ted Stephen and Frank Murkowski, and its Republican Congressman, Don Young, are ecstatic about having a candidate like George Bush, by the way, who didn't sign the largest tax increase in Massachusetts history. Therefore, we unanimously cast all 19 of our votes for the next president of the United States, George Bush.
If the other states are as windy as Alaska tonight, we may miss the election in November. We may not get out of here before then.
Arizona, 33 votes.
Madam Secretary,
Arizona, heart of the great Southwest, home of Barry Goldwater, and through him, the birthplace of the modern conservative Republican Party, proudly and with incredible enthusiasm, casts its 33 votes for the next President of the United States, George Bush.
Where are we? Arizona?
7 electoral votes in Arizona, probably safe for George Bush. It's gone Republican every year since 1960 in presidential years.
Arkansas, 27 votes.
Madam Secretary, Arkansas is a natural. #1 in the production of rice. #1 in the production of broilers in this great United States. The home of the Razorbacks. We cast 27 votes for the next President of the United States, George Bush.
6 electoral votes in Arkansas.
George Bush.
Reagan won the last 2 elections there.
175 votes.
The big enchilada in American presidential politics.
Madam Secretary, California, the nation state with the 6th largest economy in the entire world. The home state of our great president, Ronald Reagan. Out of courtesy to the home state of the next president of the United States, George Bush, passes.
California has 47 electoral votes. That's as many as Florida, Michigan, and Arkansas combined.
Passes.
Colorado, 36 votes.
Madam Secretary, the great state of Colorado, home of rugged and hard-working individuals who came west for freedom and opportunity, and home of the Rocky Mountains that inspired the writing of America the Beautiful and have the finest wilderness and skiing in the world, is also the home of part of the heart of George and Barbara Bush, because it is the home of Sharon Bush, 2 and soon to be 3 grandchildren, and George and Barbara Bush's outstanding son Neil, to whom I proudly defer.
Fellow delegates, fellow Americans, I am the first of 5 Bush children who will be announcing the votes from our respective states. It is my honor to represent a special delegation from the great state of Colorado, a state blessed with natural beauty, from the eastern plains to the western slope and the Rocky Mountains in between, a state blessed with great people, infected with the Western spirit, infected with the can-do attitude. I am proud to cast Colorado votes for a man I dearly love, a man who's been there when I needed him, a man who represents by his life that Western spirit, whose character is built on the values that are our values: family, faith, hard work, patriotism, the frontier spirit of independence. Colorado proudly cast 36 votes for my father, the next President of the United States of America, George Bush.
Very good political genes in that family.
Colorado cast 36 votes for the next great leader of America.
Connecticut, 35 votes.
Madam Secretary, Connecticut, the Constitution state, with reverence for the civil rights of every American, proudly casts 35 votes for one of its own, George Bush.
George Bush, of course, grew up in Connecticut. That beautiful small, prosperous northeastern state has 8 electoral votes.
Delaware, 17 votes.
Madam Chairwoman, I am Mike Castle, Governor of the state of Delaware, the first state in the nation, the home of Pete DuPont, where we have proven that Republican policies of low taxes provide more jobs, more growth, and higher incomes than Mike Dukakis's policies of high taxes. Cast at 17 votes for a man who has promised no tax increase, period, George Bush.
3 electoral votes in Delaware. Pete DuPont, of course, ran and didn't get very far in the Republican presidential sweepstakes.
The District of Columbia, 14 votes.
Madam Chairman, bad news about the District of Columbia is that we're the home of the big spending Democrat Congress whose liberal policies are so perfectly in tune with Mike Dukakis that if allowed to do so, they would return our country to the economic chaos of Jimmy Carter. The good news about the District of Columbia is that we are the home of the world champion Washington Redskins. And the best news is that our nation's capital is the home of our friend and neighbors, George and Barbara Bush and their family. We are deeply honored and gratified to know that they will continue to live in our city when they move next January from the Vice President's house to the White House. 14 votes for George Bush.
District of Columbia, of course, has been going steadily Democratic since 1960. One of the few safe places for the Democrats in the last 2 elections.
Florida, 82 votes.
Another big one down south, growing in electoral power.
Florida, where the emerging Republican majority is a fact of life, evidenced by having Bob Martinez elected as our Republican governor, to which I'm very honored to defer.
Florida, Spaceport for America, has launched George Bush to the presidency. Florida, the home of the state's greatest Secretary of Commerce, who made Florida known coast to coast to coast, Jeb Bush.
This is another Bush son who is the Secretary of Commerce.
It is with tremendous pride, representing the great state of Florida, that I cast the 82 delegates for the next First Lady of the United States, Barbara Bush, and the next President, George Bush.
Jeb Bush speaks Spanish, and he's been a powerful force for his father, especially in South Florida.
Georgia, 48 votes.
Madam Chairwoman, Georgia passes.
Georgia passes.
Setting up Texas so he can put it over the top.
4 votes.
Buenas noches, Maniluhu, Janmayanaho, Mr. Chairman, the people of Guam, the pearl of the Pacific, are proud to be Americans. We are proud that after 400 years, we have been given the chance to improve our relationship with America and achieve self-determination through a new Commonwealth status. I'm proud to cast our votes, as we were the first in the nation to do in February, for a man who supports our Commonwealth quest, who believes that every man and woman has the right to dignity and the freedom to choose their own destiny. Maniluho and Mananaho, Toro Hamzo ne Chamorro ne Manyasaga Gini, Estados Unidos, Gini Curaçano, o Fafaisin Hamzo Unsinia, Imbota, si George Bush, Jansi Dan Quayle for President and Vice President. Mr. Chairman, the next President of the United States of America, George Bush.
Whoops, I think he forgot to tell them how many delegates they had.
Guam, 4 votes for George Bush.
And now for my great state of Hawaii, 20 votes.
4 electoral votes here went Republican in 84, Democrat 76 and 80.
Madam Secretary, Congresswoman Psyche, what did you say was the correct pronunciation of our state?
It's Hawaii.
Hawaii. Aloha. The land of aloha. The land of the growing and dynamic Republican Party. The land of the launching pad for the Bush-Quayle dynamic role in Asia and the Pacific. My name is Gene Ward, but this is the man, David Kahanu, the chairman of the Bush campaign in Hawaii, who's going to bring us to victory.
Madam Secretary, Congresswoman Pat Psyche from Hawaii, it is a privilege and an honor to cast 20 unified votes for our next President of the United States, George Bush.
Idaho, 22 votes.
Madam Secretary, the great gem state of Idaho, land of pristine lakes, raging rivers, and of course, famous potatoes. The home of Republican Senator Jim McClure, Republican Senator Steve Sims, Republican Congressman Larry Craig, and future Republican Congressman Dane Watkins. The state that is proud to have the highest percentage of women delegates at the Republican National Convention this year. The state that gave Ronald Reagan and George Bush the second highest percentage of votes in the last 2 elections intends to celebrate its centennial by casting the highest percentage of votes this year in America for George Bush and Dan Quayle. Madam Secretary, Idaho proudly casts all 22 of its votes for the next President of the United States, George Bush.
One of the safest Republican states in the nation, Idaho. It's been going Republican in presidential elections every year since '68.
Illinois, 92 votes.
Another powerhouse state, that's the Governor, Jim Thompson.
Madam Secretary, Illinois, the Prairie State, the state that another great Republican president, Teddy Roosevelt, said in 1908 represents America more than any other state, and we still do. Illinois, the home of the first Republican president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, and Illinois, the native state of President Ronald Reagan. And Madam Secretary, Illinois, one of the homes of the next President of the United States, George Bush, if we can get away with it. Madam Secretary, the great state of Illinois, in deference to its sister, the great state of Texas, will yield. But Madam Secretary, come November, the state of Illinois will yield to no state in its support of George Bush and Dan Quayle.
Illinois passes.
Indiana, 51 votes.
Madam Secretary, our vote will be cast by the next governor of the state of Indiana, Lieutenant Governor John Mudd.
Indiana, the great Hoosier state, and the home of the next Vice President of the United States, Senator Dan Quayle. Now proudly casts its 51 votes for George Bush.
Indiana, 51 votes, George Bush.
Iowa, 37 votes.
Iowa, the great heartland of America, known for its
friendly people, strong work ethic, and excellent educational performance proudly casts all 37 of our votes for the great next President of the United States, George Bush.
And he had to get those votes from other people because George Bush, you'll remember, in Iowa finished 4th and thought that he may be over the presidential candidate shortly after he got started. But he turned it around the next week in New Hampshire.
Kansas, home of the national champion Jayhawks. Home of the great Republican legacy of Landon, Carlson, and Eisenhower. Home of Senator Nancy Kassebaum and our favorite son, Senator Bob Dole. Proudly cast our 34 votes for the next President of the United States of America, George Bush.
7 electoral votes in Kansas. It's one of those agricultural states that,
Kentucky,
under normal circumstances, could be thought to be a battleground, but with Kassebaum and
the Commonwealth of
Bob Dole
Kentucky,
working hard, it probably won't be.
the real home of the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln. The Bluegrass State, the state of beautiful women and fast horses, proudly cast its 38 votes for the next President of the United States, George Bush.
Well, the complete sentence used to be beautiful women and fast horses and fine bourbon.
Louisiana, 41 votes.
Madam Chairman, the great host state of Louisiana, where the Republican Party has grown in great numbers, where now for the first time in 1988, 1/2 of our congressional delegation belongs to Republican members. And where, in preparation for this great convention, where we will nominate the next President of the United States, 10,000 volunteers who welcomed all our friends from across this country to the great city of New Orleans. Madam Chairman, the great host state who invites you back in 1992. Madam Chairman, the great host state who is always willing to cooperate with its great sister state now passes.
Louisiana passes.
Sister state would be Texas, of course.
Maine, 22 votes.
Madam Secretary, the great state of Maine, home of 2 distinguished members of Congress, Senator Bill Cohen and Congresswoman Olympia Snowe, is a state which cherishes its unique natural resources, its unsurpassed quality of life, and a work ethic among its people second to none. And in January of 1989, the state of Maine will become the home state of the first daughter of the United States. Fellow delegates, it is my pleasure to introduce to you, for the purpose of casting Maine's 22 votes, the daughter of George and Barbara Bush, Doro Bush LeBlond.
Madam Secretary, I have never been prouder than I am this moment to be able to cast all 22 votes from the state of Maine for the most decent, the most honest, the most caring man ever to seek the presidency. A man who has made me proud every single day of my life, and a man who will make America proud. The next President of the United States, my own beloved father, George Bush.
Ms. LeBlanc was saying that it's a very emotional time for her. She's so close to her father, she has a hard time expressing it.
Cast 22 votes, George Bush.
The state of Maryland, 41 votes.
Madam Secretary, the votes of the great state of Maryland will be proudly cast by the Congress lady from the state of Maryland, the chairman of our delegation, of whom Marylanders are very proud, Congresswoman Helen Delich Bentley.
Madam Secretary, the proud, free state of Maryland, the state often referred to as America in miniature, with its mountains, farmland, racetracks, lakes, rivers, and the famous Chesapeake Bay. The home of Fort McHenry, the birthplace of our Star-Spangled Banner. The home of the great, clean seaport of Baltimore. That built America's proud clipper ships and that launched America's very first Liberty ship. Maryland, the 7th most important state to this nation's defense. Maryland, the site of the first presidential debate on September the 14th. Maryland, the site of the 25th Biennial Convention of the National Federation of Republican Women in 1989. Maryland, the state where there is no gender gap, with the delegates and alternates to this great convention evenly divided. And Maryland, the state that will elect Ambassador Alan Keyes to the United States Senate in November. And Maryland, the home of the Baltimore Orioles. Maryland is indeed very proud to cast all of its 41 votes for the 41st President of the United States of America, George Bush.
Maryland, 41 votes, George Bush.
Massachusetts, 52 votes.
Madam Secretary, my name is Joe Malone. I'm running for the United States Senate against Ted Kennedy.
Almost any mention of Ted Kennedy will bring a roar in this crowd. To so many people, and symbolizes the Democratic Party and represents all that they don't believe in. The chant is, "Where was Ted?" And that started, of course, because in Atlanta, when he made his speech, he kept raising rhetorically the question, where was George? Iran-Contra and other matters. Vice President Bush is not available to be seen on television right now because he's off helping put those grandchildren to bed, we're told. We'll see him on camera again when they go over the top from his hotel suite.
Madam Secretary, it is with great pride and pleasure that I introduce the real Massachusetts miracle, a 30-year veteran of the United States Congress, Congressman Silvio Conti.
Madam Chairman, I rise to report the vote of the delegates of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, home to the finest colleges and universities throughout the world, home of the beautiful Berkshire Hills and the sandy beaches of Cape Cod, the site of the historic Shays Rebellion against taxes, home to New England's team, the Boston Red Sox, the soaring Boston College Eagles, the 16-time World Championship Boston Celtics, the birthplace of our next president, George Bush. Mr. Chairman, Chairperson, the 52 delegates from the state of Massachusetts proudly and unanimously cast their ballots for the next president of the United States, my dear beloved friend, George Bush.
Well, that'll be a tough state to win for George Bush come the fall, of course, because the governor of the state is the nominee on the other ticket.
State of Michigan, 77 votes.
Another big prize. Michigan, 20 electoral votes, 7.5% of the 270 electoral votes needed.
As I approach the mic this evening, I have compiled a list of all those things people wanted me to mention in my report to you. In the interest of time, however, I'll only mention those things for which I've been paid. Madam Chairman, the great state of Michigan, the birthplace of the Republican Party, and the first state in the Union to start this delegate selection process in a polite, orderly, genteel, non-combative way, is anxious to cast its votes for George Bush, but will pass at this time.
Michigan, of course, was the political equivalent of mud wrestling this year between
Minnesota,
the George Bush forces and the forces of Pat Robertson. Bush prevailed.
Madam Secretary, Minnesota, the star of the North, the land of sky blue waters, fertile fields, and a few loons.
Minnesota, home of world-class senators Dave Durenberger and Rudy Boschwitz, and world championship Minnesota Twins.
Is ready to hit a grand slam for Bush and Quayle. And we start by loading the bases with all 31 votes for George Bush.
10 electoral votes in Minnesota. The last 3 elections, it's gone Democratic. Walter Mondale, of course,
31
was on the ticket in 76 and 80, and again in 84.
Madam Chairman, Mississippi is home to 2.5 million of the finest people on the face of the earth. In November, they will unite with us and will help us elect Trent Lott to join Thad Cochran in the United States Senate. Madam Chairman, our 31 super delegates proudly cast 31 votes for George Bush.
Mississippi, 31 votes, George Bush.
Mississippi's feeling pretty good, the Republican Party,
Missouri,
about George Bush's chances there.
47 votes.
Here's a battleground state.
Missouri, the Show Me State, the home of W.H.T. Bucky Bush, the home of George Bush's cousin, George Herbert Walker III, and also the home of harmony in the Republican Party. Request that our National Committee woman, Roberta Capps, who also served as chairman of the Dole for President Committee, deliver the votes from Missouri.
Madam Secretary, our delegate chairman has polled our fine Missouri delegation, and I am proud to read the report which he has handed me. 46 votes for a fine American George Bush. One vote for the shadow. Good grief, explain that one.
Obviously, there has been an error in our tally, Madam Chairman. Would you hold for just a moment, please? Mr. Telephone.
We've got 47 delegate votes. They got 46 for Bush, 1 for the shadow.
Madam Chairman,
There's
I am happy
some
to
stunt
report
going on here, probably.
47 votes for George Bush, the next president of the United States.
Missouri, 47 votes, George Bush.
Montana, 20 votes.
Big sky country. Most beautiful landscape in America or anywhere in the world. But it's gone Republican now since 1968 presidential election years. And we need their microphone.
Would you please put the mic on for Montana?
Your switch, will you put your switch on, please?
They're moving over.
No.
Just a while in Montana, but we do it right. As Montana approaches its 100th birthday, the Big Skies country will send Conrad Burns to the Senate, Stan Stevens to the governor's mansion, Jim Finlayson to Congress, and re-elect Ron Marlenet to his 7th term in Congress. And we will also vote for George Bush. We cast all 20 Montana votes for George Bush.
Thank you, Montana. 20 votes for George Bush.
Nebraska, 25 votes.
Madam Secretary, the Cornhusker State is proud indeed of its superlative governor, Kay Orr, who chaired this year's excellent platform committee. And it's a great platform. Nebraska is also the home state of the nation's youngest United States Senator, David Carnes. All right. He's a dynamic United States Senator, and we'll send him back to Washington in November. Amos, 25 votes in Nebraska are cast for George Walker Bush.
Nebraska,
Well, he's about 3/4 of the way there now, a little shy of that, as you can see.
Nevada, 20 votes.
Madam Secretary, our chairman, Nevada's beloved Senator Chick Heck, could not be here with us tonight. He's in the state for the funeral of a longtime friend. Madam Secretary, the great state of Nevada entered the Union as the Silver State, helping President Abraham Lincoln to abolish slavery forever. Tonight, we offer the richest reserves of gold in the United States to our next president, George Bush, to keep our country strong and free. Madam Secretary, Nevada casts its 20 votes for the next president of the United States, George Bush.
Nevada's one of those states that they're nervous about losing a Republican senator out there, Chick Heck, who cannot be here tonight. He's in a tough re-election campaign.
23 votes.
Madam Secretary, New Hampshire, the Granite State, the state with the lowest unemployment in the country and the strongest economy in the nation. New Hampshire is proud of our first-in-the-nation primary and our perfect record at picking presidents. With that responsibility in mind, we are proud to cast our 23 votes for the next president of the United States, George Bush.
That's where it happened for George Bush, and John Sununu was the man who made it happen for him, a very skilled governor in that state who had a terrific political organization. But wanted for George Bush.
I am Bo Sullivan, New Jersey chairman for George Bush for president, and I am proud to introduce our next United States Senator, Pete Dawkins.
Madam Secretary, New Jersey, the proud home of the keynote speaker of this convention and our great Governor Tom Kean, the home of the real economic miracle in America, a leader for the future in respect for the home state of the next President of the United States, George Bush, passes.
New Jersey passes.
Pete Dawkins, a former Heisman Trophy winner, former Army general, and challenging Senator Lautenberg in New Jersey.
Madam Chairman, New Mexico, the land of enchantment, located just a little east of LA, just a little west of DC, is very proud of the diversity of our great state. And I have, representing that diversity here, 3 good Republican friends who wish to help me indicate our support for George Bush. I have in the back Senator Bill Valentine, who we want to join Senator Pete Domenici, our great United States Senator in the United States Senate. I have Mr. Peter McDonald, Chairman of the great Navajo Nation, representing both Arizona and New Mexico. And I have Cecilia Salazar, the only Hispanic woman seeking a House of Representatives seat in the United States House of Representatives. We 4 Republicans cast our hot, chili-flavored votes for our good friend and neighbor, George Bush.
New Mexico, 26 votes, George Bush.
New York, 136 votes.
Madam Chairwoman, I'm Tony Calavita, State Chairman. New York, the great Empire State, home of Senator Al D'Amato, home of the next representative, Republican Senator from the state of New York, Bob McMillan, home of John Bush, brother of George Bush, which state was won by Reagan Bush in 1980 and again in 1984, which state will be won by Bush Quayle in 1988, with 136 delegate votes, passes.
New York also has 36 electoral votes, which really count. That's about 13.5% of the 270 needed.
North Carolina, 54 votes.
Madam Secretary and fellow delegates, as the chairman of the delegation from North Carolina Variety Vacation Land, and at the unanimous request and enthusiastic request of the North Carolina delegation, I yield the microphone to the man that we're going to re-elect on November the 8th for 4 more years as our governor, Governor Jim Martin.
Thank you, Senator Brokaw. Madam Secretary, I want to thank the delegation for offering this honor to me. I've been asked to be brief no matter how long it takes. And I want to tell those assembled here that North Carolina, the state that is ranked #1 in the nation in economic development with more new factories last year than any other state in the Union, North Carolina, the state that has one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country and certainly the lowest that we've ever had, and determined to make it even better. North Carolina that's working with our sister state of South Carolina to bring our own National Football League franchise to Carolina. North Carolina is proud to cast our 54 votes for the next president of the United States of America, George Bush.
There he is back with the older grandchildren. The younger ones have been put to bed, we're told.
North Dakota, 16 votes.
Madam Secretary, the great 1989 centennial state of North Dakota, the state that will elect Leon Malberg governor, Steve Sidness to Congress, and Earl Strindon to the United States Senate, proudly casts 16 votes for the next president of the United States, George Bush.
This is one of those Midwestern farm states that the Republicans are worried about hanging on to. The farm economy has just been terrible there, and a lot of blame from the North Dakota farm population goes to Ronald Reagan.
Madam Secretary, Ohio, the Buckeye State, is the state that will put George Bush over the top in November. But for tonight, we're willing to share that honor and give it to Texas. Ohio passes.
Ohio passes.
One of the industrial Midwestern states that will be another key battleground state.
36 votes.
Madam Chairman,
In Oklahoma, we never pass, we run the ball. The proud frontier state of Oklahoma, the home of Will Rogers, who never met a man he didn't like, of Jim Thorpe, who never ran a race he couldn't win, of Mickey Mantle, who never faced a pitcher he couldn't hit, of the Oklahoma Sooners, who never played a team they couldn't beat, and of Jean Kirkpatrick, who never addressed an audience she couldn't inspire. Proudly cast our 36 votes for our neighbor, our friend, and our fellow energy advocate from the Lone Star State, the next President of the United States, George Bush.
Oklahoma, 36
Enjoying
votes
Republican
for
since
George
1968 presidential years.
Oregon, 32 votes.
Madam Chairman, the Republicans of the great state of Oregon understand that states and nations become great by encouraging the growth of the free market and private enterprise. Madam Chairman, we are committed to the growth of our private sector, whether it be tourism, like beautiful Paradise Cove in Halem Bay, the timber industry, agriculture, small business, or the new high-tech and environmentally sound industrial developments, unlike the Massachusetts Bay of Governor Dukakis. Our commitment is to the future of our citizens, our family, and our youth. Taxation is not the answer. We are wary of Greeks bearing gifts. For the future of our state and our youth, the stability of our nation, whites, blacks, Hispanics, Asian, working, retired, young, and seniors, we are delighted to pledge the 32 delegate votes of Oregon to the next President of the United States, George Herbert Walker Bush.
Oregon, 32 votes, George Bush.
That's the state the Democrats think that they got a crack at this time in the Pacific Northwest. We'll see. It's a big state.
Madam Secretary, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, out of respect and deference to Texas, and taking a page from Joe Paterno's playbook, temporarily passes.
Pennsylvania passes.
96 delegate votes in Pennsylvania.
Puerto Rico, 14 votes.
Madam Chairman, the beautiful island of Puerto Rico, rich in traditions, and with San Juan, the oldest city under the American flag, bastion of American freedom and democracy in the Caribbean, casts all its 14 votes for the only presidential candidate who stands for equality of rights as a State of the Union and has steadfastly pledged estadidad ahora, statehood now for Puerto Rico, our great friend, George Bush.
Puerto Rico, 14 votes for George Bush.
Rhode Island, 21 votes.
Madam Secretary, I'm Governor Dupree from the great state of Rhode Island, the ocean state founded in 1636 by Roger Williams in the name of religious freedom, and I proudly, very proudly yield to Valerie Southern to report the vote of Rhode Island.
Madam Secretary, on behalf of our great Republican Governor, Edward D. Dupree, and on behalf of our proud and able Republican delegates hailing from the state of Rhode Island and the Providence Plantations, I am honored tonight as a Black American from the Ocean State to announce that our deliberations are over. We, the Rhode Island delegation, unanimously cast 21 votes for the man whom we believe will be and must be the next President of the United States, we proudly and without hesitation cast our votes for George Herbert Walker Bush.
Rhode Island, 21 votes, George Bush.
As you see, about 120 away now.
37 votes.
And we're close to Texas.
Madam Secretary, the great state of South Carolina, the Palmetto State, the freedom-loving state where more Revolutionary War battles and engagements were fought than in any other state to provide us our freedom, the state of opportunity for all people, the home of the living legend Strom Thurmond, the home of the bravest congressman in America, Floyd Spence, who has just come back from undergoing double lung transplants to come back to the campaign trail. South Carolina, a member of Team Carolina, which wants the next NFL franchise. South Carolina, the state whose primary opened the door for George Bush to sweep Super Tuesday, proudly casts all 37 votes for the next president of the United States, George Bush.
Big victory for George Bush on Super Tuesday, of course. He went in there and beat Dole, and he beat Robertson, and beat Kemp. He got almost 50% of the vote in South Carolina. Lee Atwater's home state. Another great state.
Madam Secretary, I bring you greetings on behalf of this enthusiastic delegation from the beautiful agricultural heartland of this great nation. The state that is a host to this nation's shrine of democracy, Mount Rushmore, that is a host to the shrine to our Native American brothers and sisters, Crazy Horse, a state that will celebrate its 100th year in this great union in 1989, a state that as we write the final chapter on our first century of statehood, we look forward enthusiastically to the opportunities in the next century of statehood, built on a very solid foundation of the Reagan administration, and one which will be carried on by the next president of the United States, and we proudly in that spirit cast all 18 of our delegate votes and stand firmly behind George Bush.
George Mickelson of South Dakota is the son of a former governor of the state of
18 votes for George
South Dakota.
Bush.
Graduate of the University of South Dakota. Almost there, the Vice President.
Madam Secretary, my distinguished colleague in the House of Representatives, Tennessee, the volunteer state, the state of our favorite sons, Lamar Alexander, Howard Baker, and Bill Brock, the state of candidates for Senate, Bill Anderson, for the House of Representatives, Harold Coker, Jimmy Duncan, Ed Bryant. On behalf of our distinguished state chairman, on behalf of our distinguished Bush chairman, on behalf of all this 45 delegates and all of this wonderful people, it is a privilege to enthusiastically cast all 45 votes for the next first family, George and Barbara Bush.
Tennessee, 45 votes for George Bush.
Here we go. Texas, 111 votes.
Bill Clement, who had a mild stroke recently, said he got it while watching the Democratic Convention.
Madam Secretary, as chairman of the delegation from the great state of Texas, the only state to have been a republic, and whose people continue to reflect that independence and determination, I proudly yield to George Bush, son of the next president of the United States.
Thank you, Governor. Madam Secretary, the great state of Texas proudly cast 111 votes for a man we respect and a man we love.
Texas cast all its votes for her favorite son and the best father in America, George Bush.
There it is. Secure. Well, there are more balloons up there, but they've got to save some for tomorrow night. So I think what you'll see is this demonstration. They're running about a half an hour behind time, according to their schedule, and they've now penetrated the early a.m. and the Eastern Daylight Time Zone, of course, because it's a little after midnight there. Very heavy emphasis during the course of this campaign on both sides on family. The vice president saying last week he intended to show off his family, and he did just that tonight. It's a handsome group of young and successful people, states like Maine, Florida, Texas, of course. I think somebody may see himself on television.
Here's Doro. Here's Doro.
Bush family's been out there campaigning, almost every member in all of the key states, as they did 8 years ago when he ran the first time, 1980. These are so carefully orchestrated, not just because they want to present a splendid television picture, but because they want to put their house in order before the American people. As you're watching, they want you to have good feelings about this ticket and what it represents. George Bush wants to deal with that image of privilege that he believes has plagued him unfairly, saying that he's worked hard in places like Texas, where he went after he graduated from Yale, and that he served his country during World War II, which he did, having gone at a tender age of 18 and 19 to become a naval aviator. So just as the Democrats orchestrated their convention, the Republicans are doing that here tonight.
I don't get there's Doro. Get the pointer out. Good. Good going. Well done with the pointer.
Pictures are carried on the television screen. Well, see with big smiles because they're watching themselves on the television screen. Beach balls.
When they handed out the champagne in Atlanta, Mike Dukakis passed. There is no champagne in this picture, so they won't have that moment of temporary awkwardness.
I wonder if George Bush was trying to get rid of the
I don't think there's much difference between these tickets on the fundamental family values that their individual families represent. There are big differences in terms of policies, but
in terms of personal style, Tom, of love and affection within the family?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I don't think there's any difference at all. The Democrats did steal the family playbook from the Republicans that they started in 1980 and are doing it very successfully this year. And you see, in a sense, a kind of a counterattack at this convention, which has emphasized not only in the speeches, but in the images that we saw this evening of the Bush family, the strongest possible signal about family solidarity.
All the polling indicates that you care a lot. That we all care in America about the place of family and about the threats to it socially and politically and financially. What to do about situations where both parents have to work, for example. What happens to the children? What kind of daycare should there be? What kind of assistance should there be for the elderly in America? What should we do about education reform? What should we do about sex education? These are issues that are going to become primary in this presidential campaign, as they have to a degree that they haven't been in the past.
You will not see this election fought on things like Kimoy and Matsu or Africa or colonialism or international issues. You see it fought in the parlor.
Now the big test for Vice President George Bush will be his speech before this hall tomorrow night. He knows that he must make a commanding performance here. He's the top of the ticket. He's no longer the man who stands deferentially just a step back from the President of the United States. He's got to step forward, take command of these delegates, this party, and spell out for the United States his vision of where he wants this country to go if he's elected president.
Ladies and gentlemen, these ladies
It's the most important speech he'll ever give.
their obligation up here.
I feel a little bad for a couple of states. I mean, Tennessee didn't get to talk about the Tennessee Walking Horse or Bourbon or the University of Texas football team.
Well, they're going back to some of that now, according to the convention schedule.
Right. State of Washington, for example. The Pacific Rim, home of Seattle. Home of the Yakima Valley, America's great agricultural regions.
The chair would like to restore order.
Well, George Bush said in 1980, it ain't over till the fat lady sings, but I think he is comfortable now in the fact that she's had her aria.
Right. Mr. Vice President, if you're listening to Fat Lady sang tonight and she gave you all the high notes.
Ladies and gentlemen, please let's have order with our Secretary.
Have a role to fulfill. Permit them, please, in the quiet to complete their chore. Thank you very much. Go ahead, please.
For the record, Texas cast 111 votes for the next President of the United States, George Bush.
Utah, 26 votes.
Madam Secretary, you've seen the first half, now comes the second half. Utah, a great and pretty state, a state of industry, a state of education, a state of opportunity for all of our citizens, a state with the greatest snow on earth, a state with the greatest earth on show, the home of the great senators Hatch and Garn and Congressman Nielsen and Hansen, and soon-to-be Congressman Snellgrove. The state that gave the Reagan-Bush ticket the highest percentage in 1980 and 1984, and will do the same for the Bush-Quayle ticket, is proud to cast our 26 votes for the next President of the United States of America, George Bush.
Utah, 26 votes, George Bush.
Vermont.
Well, that's a little frosting on the cake from the state of Utah. They didn't talk about their snow, which is what they generally do. The greatest snow on earth, it says in the license plates out there. John, now the serious business of this convention. Tomorrow night for George Bush. He knew that he was going to win it here tonight. It was all carefully worked out in advance, but it was still a joyful moment for him. But tomorrow night, he can't work it out in advance. He has to deliver the most important speech of his political career. He has to go before this assemblage of Republicans and before the country and persuade them that he would be a superior president of the United States to Michael Dukakis. I mean, that's really what it's all about.
It's a cruel world, politics, Tom, as you well know. Michael Dukakis made a pretty good speech in Atlanta. He is no barn burner of a speaker. He's no Demosthenes. But now Bush has to come up and try to match that, and so much does ride on the public perception of what really people don't do when they're running the country. They don't make speeches in big halls like this.
That's right, and what they have to do is deliver as a performer and then they have to deliver the substance as well, spell out for the country where they want to take this nation. And the tricky part for George Bush is that he's following this enormously popular man, Ronald Reagan, and he's got to take what he can from the Reagan Revolution, the Reagan program, and then design for all of us the Bush program, extending the Reagan Revolution with two new faces on it, George Bush and Dan Quayle. Well, we'll be watching all of this tomorrow on all of the NBC News programs, beginning with NBC News at sunrise, followed by Today. I'll be here tomorrow night on NBC Nightly News, and then we'll be back again tomorrow night for our primetime coverage of this climactic evening of the Republican National Convention at the Superdome in New Orleans, 1988. On behalf of all of us at NBC, good evening.